They stripped her of her name before she was old enough to fight back, took her bloodline, her estate, her future, buried it all under forged documents and a servant's brand. For 22 years, Seris Vale survived on scraps and silence, while the people who stole everything from her dined at tables she cleaned with bleeding hands. But tonight, inside a palace built from the bones of conquered nations, the most dangerous king on the continent just knelt in broken glass to pick her up off the floor. And the people who destroyed her? They're still in that room. Stay until the end. This story will break you open and rebuild you harder. Drop your city in the comments. Let me know who's watching tonight. They always say the cold up in the Ashmore Highlands builds character. What they don't say is that it also builds graves. The wind that came down from the Kelvrath Peaks carried no mercy in it. Not in summer, not in the brief gray weeks the locals called autumn, and certainly not in the dead stretch of late winter when the Imperial Concord Summit demanded that the most powerful rulers on the continent gather beneath one roof and pretend they trusted each other. The cold up there was the kind that got inside your joints and stayed. The kind that reminded every living thing, noble or servant, predator or prey, that the mountain did not care who you were. It had been killing people long before titles were invented, and it would go on killing people long after the last dynasty crumbled to dust. Seris Vale had understood this about cold since she was 9 years old. She understood it the first winter after her parents disappeared, when the Ashmore household assigned her a sleeping mat in a stone corridor with no fire access and told her the blanket allocation had already been distributed. She understood it at 11, when Lord Corvin Ashmore explained in very calm, very measured language that her presence in the main household was a generosity extended on his part, and that generosity had conditions. She understood it at 14, when those conditions first required a leather strap across her back for the crime of eating bread that had been intended for the hunting dogs. By 22, Seris had stopped measuring cold by temperature. She measured it by behavior, by the particular set of a person's jaw when they looked at her, by the quality of silence in a room when she entered it. Cold was not weather, cold was people. And she had learned to read it the way seasoned soldiers read terrain, fast, accurate, without flinching. Tonight, in the servant preparation halls beneath the Imperial Concord Palace, the cold was everywhere. The palace itself was something out of a fever dream. Black marble towers rose against the silver-clouded sky like accusations. The banners of 17 conquered territories snapped in the mountain wind along the outer walls, each one representing a dominion that had been crushed into submission and then invited to celebrate its own subjugation with formal dinners and diplomatic language. Inside, the chandeliers were forged from obsidian crystal, not glass, crystal, the real stuff, mined from the Marath caverns where men still died every season pulling it out of the earth. The light they threw was cold and beautiful, and it illuminated nothing honestly. Seris had been assigned to tray service for the opening reception. This was considered the lowest position on the serving rotation. The trays were heavy. The routes were long. The guests were the kind of people who treated a servant's body as an extension of the furniture, something to move around, to deposit glasses onto, to ignore entirely until it failed to be useful. She had arrived at the preparation hall at 4 in the morning. The summit did not begin until 7 in the evening. 15 hours of standing, of waiting, of enduring the particular cruelty of preparation, the knowledge that the work ahead of you will be brutal before you have even begun. The other servants moved around her with the automatic courtesy of shared suffering. Nobody spoke much. There was an economy of language in places like this, born not from coldness but from exhaustion. Words cost energy. Energy was scarce. You saved it for the things that mattered. Seris wrapped her left forearm in a strip of linen she had stolen from the supply closet 3 weeks ago. Not stolen, borrowed. That was what she told herself. The distinction mattered less than the action, but the language still mattered to her. She was not a thief. She refused to become what the Ashmore household had spent years trying to make her become. The bruises under the linen were 4 days old. They had gone from purple to yellow-green, which meant they were healing, which meant she had survived another week intact. This was what passed for victory in the architecture of her life. Surviving intact, not thriving, not advancing, just remaining in one piece from one end of the week to the other. She was good at it by now. That was the complicated thing about survival as a long-term condition. You get so efficient at it that it starts to look like acceptance. From the outside, From the perspective of anyone observing Seris Vale moving through the preparation hall with her head down, and her movements precise, and her face carefully neutral, she appeared to be a woman who had made peace with her circumstances. A servant doing servant work. A person who had found her place. From the inside, it was something else entirely. From the inside, it was a controlled burn. Constant, low level, devastating. The kind of fire that does not produce flame because it has been denied oxygen for so long that it has learned to consume itself instead. There was a part of Seris, a part she kept behind walls she had built so carefully they had become invisible even to her, that had never accepted a single day of what had been done to her. That part did not make speeches. It did not strategize. It simply endured, and in enduring it preserved something that the Ashmore household had been trying to extinguish since the day she arrived. She had no name for it. She only knew it was still there because sometimes, in the narrow hours before dawn when the hall was quiet and she was alone with her mat and her thin blanket and the sound of the mountain wind outside, she still felt angry. Not sad, not resigned, angry. She held on to that. She held on to it the way drowning people hold on to wreckage, not because it was comfortable, but because it was something solid in all that dark water. The preparation hall supervisor, a compact man named Breath, who had worked summit events for 11 years and had the eyes of someone who had witnessed more political ugliness than he would ever discuss, moved through the rows of servants with his clipboard and his quiet precision. "Vale," he said, stopping beside her. He did not look up from the clipboard. "Tray 4, Grand Ballroom Circuit, East Corridor to West. Don't stop moving. Don't make eye contact with the Drax delegation." "Understood. I mean it about the Drax delegation." Now he did look up. His eyes were not unkind, but they carried the weight of professional concern, which was a different thing from personal concern. The King's advance team swept the space this morning. They were looking for something. I don't know what. Just keep your head down tonight. I always keep my head down. Breath looked at her for a moment. Something passed across his face that might have been sympathy or might have been recognition. Then he moved on down the row. Seris finished wrapping her arm. She did not think about the Drax delegation. She did not think about kings. She thought about getting through the night. The trouble with Lord Corvin Ashmore was not that he was a monster. Monsters were simple. Monsters had appetites you could map and therefore avoid. The trouble with Corvin was that he was a strategist who had decided very early in his career that morality was a resource management problem. You allocated it where it produced returns and withheld it where it created drag. Over 30 years of applied power, this philosophy had produced an extraordinarily efficient nobleman, efficient at accumulation, at social positioning, at the particular brand of sophisticated cruelty that does not leave marks the law can read. He had married twice and buried both wives. The official records listed natural causes. Natural causes was a phrase that did a great deal of work in Ashmore documentation. His daughter Nisera was 25, 3 years older than Seris, and she had inherited her father's capacity for strategy and her mother's talent for making devastation feel like etiquette. She was, by every measurable standard of her society, a success. Beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful, precisely, deliberately, in a manner that communicated its own cost. Intelligent, socially lethal. She had been groomed since childhood for a marriage that would advance the Ashmore name into the highest tier of dynastic power, and she had accepted this grooming not with resignation, but with genuine enthusiasm, because Nisera Ashmore had decided long ago that ambition was the only thing worth being. The summit was, in her calculation, her moment. King Vaelor Drax was unmarried. He was 31. His dominion was the largest military power on the continent. A marriage alliance between Stormfang and Ashmore would elevate Corvin's legacy from influential minor lord to architect of a dynastic empire. And Nisera had spent the last 2 years positioning herself precisely for this opportunity. The right social contacts, the right rumors seated in the right courts, the right performance of exactly the kind of strength-adjacent femininity she understood powerful men were supposed to desire. She did not know that powerful men rarely wanted what they were supposed to want. She did not know a great many things about Vaelor Drax. She found Seris in the service corridor at 6:45 in the evening, 15 minutes before the opening reception. Seris was balancing her tray and trying to remember whether the East Corridor had the 2-step threshold or the flat floor. The last thing she needed tonight was a stumble. When she heard footsteps that she recognized the way you recognize a particular quality of danger. Not loud footsteps, not angry footsteps, deliberate ones. Footsteps that belonged to someone who had already decided what was about to happen. She turned. Nicera was in sapphire silk, her dark hair swept into an architectural arrangement that had taken 3 people 40 minutes to build. She was holding a small silver blade, decorative by design, which meant it was ceremonial, which meant it was intended as a social weapon rather than a combat one. In the right circles, a ceremonial blade carried specific meaning. It said, "I have the authority to mark you, and I intend to use it." The corridor was empty. Of course it was empty. Nicera had timed this. "You've been assigned to the East Circuit," Nicera said. Not a question. "Yes, my lady." "That puts you in the King's sightline twice per rotation." Nicera tilted her head, and there was something in the gesture that was almost clinical. Almost. "I need you on the kitchen relay instead." Supervisor Breath assigned me to. Breath answers to my father. My father answers to the requirements of this summit. The requirements of this summit include me not having a soot-stained inconvenience orbiting the East Corridor while I'm managing first impressions. Nicera stepped closer. "You understand what I'm telling you." Seris understood perfectly. She also understood that if she moved to the kitchen relay, she would be in violation of Breath's direct assignment, which would give Corvan grounds for discipline, which was likely the secondary purpose of this conversation. The primary purpose was the blade. "I'll need to clear the reassignment with Breath," Seris said. "No," said Nicera. "You won't." The strike was fast, not savage, controlled. Nicera was not a brawler. She was a precision instrument, and she deployed the blade the way she deployed everything else, with intention and without waste. The cut crossed Seris's left forearm just above the linen wrap. Shallow. 1.5 inches, maybe 2. The kind of wound that would heal in a week under normal circumstances. Seris felt the sting, clamped down on it immediately, and said nothing. She had learned a long time ago that pain was not the dangerous part of Nicera's methods. The dangerous part was the response to pain, because the response was what they were measuring. If you flinched visibly, you had given them data. If you cried, you had given them leverage. If you reacted with anger, you had given them justification. So Seris stood very still and said nothing, and looked at a point approximately 2 inches to the left of Nicera's shoulder. Nicera watched her for a moment. Something that might have been frustration moved across her face. She had wanted a reaction. She always wanted a reaction. And the fact that she rarely got one from Seris was a specific, chronic irritation that had been building for years. "Kitchen relay," Nicera said, "and clean that up before anyone sees it. You're already an embarrassment." She walked away. The footsteps receded. Seris looked down at her arm. The blood was seeping through the linen wrap in a thin, dark line. The cut burned with a particular quality she had not felt from cuts before. A deep, radiating sensation that moved outward from the wound rather than staying localized. She had been cut before, many times, in many ways. This was different. She didn't have time to examine why. She had 12 minutes to make a decision about the assignment and get to her position. She went to the East Corridor. This was not defiance for its own sake. This was survival math. The kitchen relay position would put her under Corvin's direct oversight for the entire evening, which was precisely where she did not want to be during a summit of this significance. The East Corridor was crowd cover. The East Corridor was anonymity. The East Corridor was the closest thing to invisible she was going to get tonight. Also, if she was being honest with herself in the way she only permitted herself to be in very small, carefully contained moments. The burning in her arm was getting worse, and she needed to be somewhere that put distance between herself and Nicera, because something about that blade was wrong. The ballroom opened at 7. By 7:15, it was operating at full political pressure. 17 delegations moving through choreographed social geometry, every conversation a negotiation, every smile a calculation, every laugh precisely calibrated to communicate alliance potential without conceding leverage. Seris had worked summit events 3 times before, and she had developed a professional appreciation for the particular theater of it, the way power dressed itself in courtesy, the way ambition moved through a crowd wearing the costume of pleasure. Tonight she observed it through a feverish haze that was getting incrementally worse. The cut burned. The burning was no longer localized to the forearm. It had moved up her elbow, into her shoulder, and was now producing a low, insistent heat behind her sternum. Her vision was doing something strange at the edges. Not blurring exactly. Sharpening, then softening, then sharpening again, as though her eyes couldn't agree on what distance the world was at. She kept moving. Tray glass. Tray glass. The circuit. Lord Corvin arrived at 7:20 with Nicera on his arm and a delegation of 3 advisors who moved like men who were paid to make their employer look powerful by comparison. Corvin himself was 63, silver-haired, still carrying the physical presence of the apex predator he was, not physically imposing in the way that came from combat, but imposing in the specific way that came from decades of watching people calculate whether they could afford to disobey you and watching them arrive at the correct answer. He scanned the ballroom with the automated efficiency of a man conducting threat assessment, and when his gaze swept past Seris, it carried the particular quality of a man who does not see a person standing in his path. He saw an obstacle with a tray. He redirected his attention. Nicera spotted her immediately. Their eyes met for precisely 1 second. Nicera's expression did not change. That was its own message. Seris broke eye contact and kept moving. The burning reached her jaw. At 7:40, King Vaelor Drax entered the ballroom. He did not announce himself. There were people whose job was to announce him, a herald with a staff, and a trained voice, and an introduction prepared in 3 languages. And Vaelor walked past all of them without acknowledgement, which was not rudeness. It was efficiency. He did not need an introduction. Every person in the room knew exactly who he was, and the 2 seconds of sonic processing required for the herald's speech were 2 seconds that belonged to him, and he had decided not to allocate them to ceremony. He entered the way weather enters a space, not through a door so much as through a shift in atmospheric pressure. Seris saw him from the far side of the ballroom through the crowd, and her first coherent thought, through the fever, through the burning, through the increasing difficulty of maintaining a straight line on the circuit, was that she understood now why Breath had issued the warning. There was something about Vaelor Drax that cut through professional training the way strong light cuts through ordinary glass. Not just the physical presence of him, though that was real enough. The black military coat, the controlled economy of his movement, the way his eyes moved through a room with the systematic precision of a man who had spent his life reading environments for threats. It was something beneath the surface, something that operated at a register she could not name. She looked away. She kept moving. The fever spiked at 8:15. It hit her mid-circuit, between the northeast pillar and the 3rd service station, and for a moment the ballroom tilted in a way that had nothing to do with architecture. Her tray wobbled. She caught it. The burning had spread from her jaw into her skull and was now producing a sound beneath hearing, a frequency that sat somewhere between pressure and noise that made the obsidian chandelier light seem too bright and the music too distant simultaneously. She thought, I need water. She thought, I need to sit down. She thought, I cannot sit down. She thought, water, just water. Make it to the service station. She made it 11 more steps before the ballroom floor changed its relationship with her feet. There was a moment, very brief, very total, of pure weightlessness. Then the tray left her hands. The sound it made was enormous. Crystal on marble produces a specific quality of destruction, not just breaking, but shattering, and not just shattering, but somehow broadcasting the violence of the break to every corner of a room in the same instant. The chandeliers threw the sound back and forth between themselves. Every conversation in the ballroom stopped. 340 people turned at once. Seris hit the floor a half-second after the tray. The blood was already on her. Not from the fall. The linen had soaked through completely at some point in the last 40 minutes, and the fever had prevented her from registering it. She lay in the wreckage of crystal and silver and spilled wine, and she was aware of exactly 2 things with absolute clarity. The burning in her body had reached her eyes, and the room had gone completely silent. The silence was the worst part. Not because it was quiet, because she knew exactly what it meant. She had spent 22 years being fluent in the language of silences, and this one said, "You have made a spectacle of yourself in the most politically significant room in the Dominion, and there will be consequences for this that will outlast tonight." Shame hit before pain. Always shame before pain. That was the specific grammar of a life lived under Ashmore discipline. First shame, because shame was the thing they had trained her to feel fastest. Shame was the first response they had carved into her nervous system through years of patient, systematic conditioning. Then pain, which was secondary. Then calculation. Assess, adapt, survive. She was trying to get her hands under her when the crowd moved. She expected guards. She had already begun the mental preparation for being handled roughly, for the specific indignity of being dragged to a back corridor while 300 people watched with the particular expression that combines disgust with relief that it is not happening to them. What she did not expect was a single set of footsteps that cut through the crowd like they owned the geometry of the room. What she did not expect was black wool in a hand that did not grab, but steadied. What she did not expect was to look up and find King Vaelor Drax crouching in the broken glass beside her. Up close, he was realer than she had prepared for. Not the polished legend version of him that existed in political discourse and court gossip, but an actual man, jaw set hard, a scar running from the outer corner of his left eye toward his ear that she could see clearly from this distance. Eyes that were gold in a way that was not metaphorical but literal. The amber gold of firelight through old glass. And in those eyes, something that she had no immediate category for because no one had ever looked at her that way before in her life. He was not looking at her with pity. He was not looking at her with the patient condescension of a powerful person managing an inconvenient scene. He was looking at her with urgency, and beneath the urgency with something that operated like recognition. His hand was on her shoulder. "Easy," he said. His voice was low. It was the voice of a man who did not need volume to be heard. "Don't move fast." Her own voice came out wrong, too thin. "I'm fine. I apologize for—" "You're not fine." Not an argument. An observation delivered with the flat authority of someone who has been making accurate assessments in high-pressure situations for a long time. "What happened to your arm?" Not a question. He had already seen the blood. She became aware of the room again, of 340 people watching, of Nicera Ashmore standing near the entrance with an expression she could not afford to read because reading it required focus she did not currently have, of Lord Corvin, somewhere in the crowd, recalibrating. "It's nothing," Seris said. Vaelor looked at the blood-soaked linen. He looked at her face. She watched him take the information in and file it with the same systematic efficiency she had noted from across the room. "It is not nothing," he said. He stood. He looked at the assembled court, the 17 delegations, the advisors, the herald who had never been able to announce him, the nobles with their champagne and their calculations and their very expensive clothing, and the entire apparatus of political theater in the room simply stopped operating because there was something about the way Vaelor Drax was standing in that moment that communicated, without theatrics and without volume, that the social contract of the evening had just been suspended. "Who?" he said into the silence. "Poisoned her." The question was quiet. It landed like a structural collapse. Seris watched Nicera's hand tighten on her wine glass from 12 feet away and felt the burning in her own blood pulse once, hard, in what she would not have called a warning because she had no framework yet for what was happening inside her body. She did not know, in that moment, that the blade had been coated with a compound called Wyrm silver, a military toxin used for decades in the Ashmore campaigns to suppress the awakening of bloodline abilities in targets who needed to be kept manageable. She did not know that she had been receiving smaller, careful doses of it in her food for years, which was why her body had never done the thing it was supposed to do, had never become what her bloodline had always meant for her to become. She did not know any of that yet. What she knew was this: a king was standing in broken glass demanding to know who had hurt her, and the most powerful woman in the room had just gone very, very still. Vaelor did not wait for an answer from the crowd. He crouched back down. He gathered her up. She had not been carried since she was too young to remember being carried, and the shock of it, the physical reality of it, the fact of being picked up off the floor by arms that had no hesitation in them whatsoever, produced a response in her she was completely unprepared for. Not relief, not comfort, something older and more complicated than either of those. Something that lived in the chest, behind the sternum, in the place where the burning had been building for 22 years alongside the anger. "I have legs," she said. The protest was automatic, trained into her. You don't accept this kind of attention, Attention of this order produces debt you cannot repay. I know you have legs. His voice was the same, low, certain. You can use them again in approximately 2 hours. Right now they're carrying poison. She had nothing to say to that. He carried her out of the ballroom. The crowd parted. She looked back once. Corvin Ashmore was watching the door through which they had just passed with an expression she had seen on his face exactly once before. 3 years ago, when a financial negotiation he had engineered over several months had collapsed at the last hour because someone had found evidence he had not managed to suppress. That expression was not anger, it was not fear, it was the precise, cold expression of a man rapidly recalculating the cost structure of a plan that had just encountered an obstacle he had not anticipated. That expression, more than anything that had happened in the last 40 minutes, told Seris that something fundamental had changed tonight. She did not know what. She only knew it had. The Imperial penthouse occupied the top floor of the palace's central tower, and it was, by any reasonable metric, absurd. Not in a decadent way. Vaelor Drax did not run to decoration, which was evident in the absence of ornamental anything in the space. The absurdity was purely architectural, floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides overlooking mountain ranges that went on until they blurred into cloud, a ceiling so high it was structurally its own weather system, and the kind of absolute quiet that only exists at altitude, when the wind is between passes and the mountain holds its breath. The healer arrived 3 minutes after they did. Lucian Vey was 40-something, gray-bearded, with the specific brand of calm that belongs to people who have spent their careers in operating conditions where panic is the most dangerous thing in the room. He wore the emblem of the Stormfang Medical Corps, and he moved the way all good healers move, with purpose distributed evenly across every action, no motion wasted. He took one look at the blood and began cutting away the linen. Vaelor stood at the foot of the bed. He had set her down with the same lack of ceremony with which he had picked her up, efficiently, carefully, without making it a gesture. She was upright against the headboard, watching Lucien work on her arm, and she was also watching Vaelor in her peripheral vision the way she watched everything she needed to understand without appearing to examine. The blade was silver, Lucien said. Not to her, to Vaelor. Recent coating. The compound in the wound is Wyram silver concentrate. The word meant nothing to Seris. The stillness that moved through Vaelor's body meant everything. How long has she been symptomatic? Lucien asked. She was on circuit when she collapsed, Vaelor said. Before that, he looked at her. How long were you feeling it? She had learned a very long time ago to be careful with information. Every piece of information you surrendered was a piece of leverage you were transferring to the person you surrendered it to. Even now, even in this room, even through the fever and the burning and the strange new quality of the air around Vaelor Drax, that she could not explain or quantify, the habit was deep. Since before the reception, she said, which was true and told him nothing. Vaelor's jaw shifted. It was a small movement. Most people would not have caught it. Seris caught it because she had spent 22 years reading small movements on faces that were trying not to show her what they were thinking. He was angry. Not at her. The distinction was almost as disorienting as being carried. Lucien administered a compound from a small glass bottle, pressed it to the edge of the wound without breaking the seal of the skin, letting the treatment absorb through contact, and the burning in her arm dropped from a roar to a hiss over the following 90 seconds. She exhaled without meaning to. There will be more compound in her system than just the wound, Lucien said. She needs a full blood assessment. Do it. It'll take an hour minimum. Do it. Lucien nodded and moved to his kit. The room was very quiet. Seris looked at the windows. The mountains were invisible now, only clouds, and the suggestion of peaks somewhere behind them, and the occasional shift of wind across the glass. You should go back to the reception, she said. No. There are 17 delegations downstairs. Kaelin will manage the delegations. He said it the way you say something about a fact of the world that requires no further discussion. That's what Kaelin does. She looked at him directly for the first time since the ballroom. He was standing with his arms at his sides, which she noticed because most powerful men in situations they are managing tend to cross their arms or put their hands on their hips or do something else that expands their silhouette. He was not doing any of that. He was just standing there, watching her with those gold eyes. And there was something in his stillness that was the opposite of threatening. It was the stillness of something that does not need to perform its own strength because it has already settled the question of whether strength exists. Why? She said. He considered the question seriously. Because someone poisoned you in my palace, he said. And someone in my palace being poisoned is a failure of order that belongs to me. I'm a servant. Yes. That's not... She stopped, reorganized. Servants collapse at these events. It happens. You don't... Not from worm silver. The word again. Still nothing to her. What is that? She said. Something moved across his face. Not hesitation. Vaelor Drax did not appear to be a man who hesitated in any conventional sense. More like a recalibration. Like a man who had just received information that was changing the parameters of what he had thought this conversation was about. It's a bloodline suppressant, he said. Military grade. It's used to prevent apex shifters from accessing their... He stopped. Has anyone tested your blood before? Formally. For what? For bloodline indicators. She stared at him. I'm from Ashmore, she said. I'm a servant. There's nothing in my blood to... When did you start working for the Ashmore household? The question was quiet and precise and landed with the weight of something that had been waiting to be asked. When I was 8, she said, after my parents died. And your parents were deceased. There's no record of... Who told you there was no record? Lord Corvin, she did not say. She did not say it because in the act of not saying it, she heard it, and she heard something in it that she had never heard before, which was the specific sound of a lie that had been hiding inside the truth of her own story for so long it had become invisible. Seris, Lucien said from across the room. She looked at him. He had finished the blood draw. He was holding the vial up to the penthouse light, and his expression had done something that very composed professional men's expressions almost never do in professional contexts. What? She said. Lucien looked at Vaelor. Tell her, Vaelor said. Lucien set down the vial with care. The markers in your blood, he said, choosing each word with the deliberateness of a man who understands that some information is so structurally significant that the manner of its delivery will determine what the recipient can do with it. The bloodline markers are Valecrest strain. Ancient Valecrest, full spectrum, undiluted, unbroken. He paused. Seris, the Valecrest line has been listed as extinct for 20 years. The room was very still. Extinct, she repeated. That's what the records say. The last heir died, the line collapsed, the estate was absorbed through... He stopped. Through what? She said. Lucien looked at Vaelor again. Vaelor looked at her. Through purchase, he said, by the Ashmore household, 18 years ago. His voice had not changed. It was still that same low, controlled register. But beneath it now there was something that had not been there before. Something that was very contained and very cold, and that she recognized from experience as what controlled anger sounds like when it has decided not to be controlled much longer. Lucien, pull the Ashmore estate acquisition records. I want the full documentation in this room in the next 30 minutes. You'll have it. Lucien left. The door closed. She was alone with Vaelor Drax in a penthouse above the mountains in the middle of the most significant political summit of the decade, and her blood was apparently something that had not existed for 20 years, and the family she had spent her entire life serving had apparently purchased the right to make it not exist. She thought about the burning in her arm that had started the moment Nicera's blade touched her skin. She thought about the smaller, slower burning that had been somewhere beneath her skin for as long as she could remember. Not fever, not illness, just a heat that came and went and that she had attributed over the years to stress, to poor nutrition, to the accumulation of years of physical labor. She thought about the anger she had kept behind walls. She thought about how it had always been there. How long? She said. Her voice was very steady. She was proud of that. She had earned that steadiness through years of practice, and she was going to use it now even though what was happening inside her chest felt like a structural event. How long has it been suppressed? She said. Vaelor looked at her with those gold eyes. Based on the compound levels Lucien is going to find in that blood draw, he said, I would estimate years, not weeks, not months. He paused. Years. She closed her eyes. Behind her eyelids, in the dark behind the fever, and the burning, and the seismic shift of everything she thought she knew about her own history, something moved, something enormous and old and deeply, deeply patient. It had been waiting. It had been waiting for a long time with the specific patience of something that knows it is real and knows, eventually, the things built to contain it will fail. She opened her eyes. I want, she said, to see the records. You'll have them, and I want to stand up when I do. A pause. The corner of his mouth shifted. It was the smallest possible movement. An hour, he said. Give the treatment an hour. She gave it an hour. It was the longest hour of her life. And it was also the first hour she had spent in a long time that did not feel like survival. It felt like something else, something she did not have reliable language for because she had not had occasion to use it. It felt like the beginning of something. Kaelin Morvain arrived at the 50-minute mark. He was Vaelor's strategic commander, and he was built like the word tactical, compact, efficient, with the eyes of someone who processes information at speeds that leave most people feeling slightly outpaced. He was also apparently the kind of man who could seal a ballroom, manage 17 delegations, run a document retrieval from Imperial records, and arrive at a penthouse briefing with a folder of evidence in under an hour without appearing to have broken a sweat. He laid the folder on the table beside the bed. House Valecrest, he said to Seris, with the directness of someone who has decided that the most respectful thing he can do in this moment is treat her as someone capable of handling information rather than needing to be insulated from it. Disappeared from official records 22 years ago, which is the year you were born. Their estate, their financial holdings, and their bloodline registry were transferred to Ashmore control through a series of legal instruments that... He stopped, opened the folder. There are 7 forged signatures in this documentation. The forgeries were good. They would have passed any standard review. They passed every review for 22 years, Vaelor said. Until tonight. He looked at Seris. The bloodline markers Lucian pulled don't lie, Kaelin said. House Valecrest isn't extinct. She is House Valecrest. Seris looked at the documents. She looked at 22 years of her own life, rendered in ink and official stamp, and the careful architecture of a theft so comprehensive it had buried not just a family's property, but the family's very existence. She looked at the name at the top of the original document. House Valecrest. Heir designate. Status, deceased. She was 22 years old, and she had been legally dead since she was born. Corvin knew, she said. Not a question. He constructed this, Kaelin said, the entire legal apparatus. The debt documentation, the servant assignment, the suppression compound in her food. He paused. We're estimating the Wirram silver microdosing began around age 12, which is approximately when a Valecrest bloodline manifestation would typically begin. 12. She had been 12 when the headaches started. She had been 12 when the heat began, the low, constant warmth beneath her skin that came and went. She had attributed it to the poor conditions of the servants' quarters, to malnutrition. She had told herself it was something wrong with her body. They had told her nothing was wrong with her body. They had known exactly what it was, and they had been managing it chemically for 10 years. 10 years. She was very still. Then she said in this quietest voice she had used all evening, He put it in my food. The room registered the weight of this. Yes, Kaelin said. Every day. We believe so. She looked at the documents. She looked at her hands. The burning in her arm had faded to almost nothing under Lucian's treatment, but the other burning, the deeper one, the one behind her sternum, the one that had lived inside her since she was 12 years old and that she had spent 10 years calling sickness. That burning was doing something new. It was spreading, not outward into pain this time, inward, deeper. It felt like recognition, like something remembering what it was. You need to stand up, Vaelor said. There was something different in his voice now, something alert. He was watching her with the same systematic precision she had noted in the ballroom, but focused now, sharp. Seris, you need to stand up and get away from the furniture. She looked at him. Why? Because the worm silver is metabolizing, he said, and what happens next is going to require space. She started to ask what he meant. She got approximately half the question formed before the burning reached her spine. The documents fell. The world contracted to a single point of white heat that lived somewhere between her shoulder blades, and she understood, with a clarity that bypassed language entirely and spoke directly to something older than thought, that the walls she had built over 22 years, the ones inside her body, the ones inside her blood, the ones she had not known were walls because she had not known what they were containing, were about to come down. From very far away, she heard Kaelin say something urgent. From even farther away, she heard Vaelor tell him to get back. She tried to say, "I'm fine." She was not fine. She was not anything she had been before. The heat detonated, and in the last coherent second before it took everything, through the white fire and the shaking and the roar that was not sound, but was also not silence, she heard something that she had never heard before in her life, and that she recognized instantly and absolutely, and with the totality of everything she was, her own voice. Not the voice she had trained to be small. The real one. The one that had been waiting. It said one thing before the world went white. It said, "Not anymore." And then the penthouse windows exploded outward, and the mountain answered. The tremor registered on 3 seismic monitoring stations in the lower Dominion. In the ballroom, 7 floors below, 340 people felt the floor move beneath them and looked up at the ceiling and then at each other with the particular expression of people who have just understood, too late, that tonight was not going to be what any of them planned. Lord Corvin Ashmore set down his glass. His hand, when he set it down, was not entirely steady. In the service corridor, 3 floors below the penthouse, a guard posted at the stairwell access door heard a sound that his training had no category for. Not an explosion, not a collapse, something older than both, and pressed his communicator with shaking hands and said, in a voice much quieter than he intended, "The windows did not shatter so much as surrender." That was the distinction that stayed with Kaelin Morvain afterward, when he tried to reconstruct the sequence of events for the official record and found that language kept failing him at the precise moment he needed it most. Glass that shatters does so because something external strikes it. Glass that surrenders does so because something internal has exceeded the tolerance of the material containing it. The penthouse windows went outward in a single, simultaneous exhale. Not violent, not explosive in the conventional military sense he was trained to recognize, but total. Floor to ceiling, all 3 walls, gone. The mountain air came in like a verdict. Cold. Absolute. Carrying the smell of ice and altitude and something else beneath those things. Something older, something that operated below the register of ordinary sensory classification, that the animal part of Kaelin's nervous system recognized before his conscious mind did, and responded to by taking 3 steps backward without his permission. He had served Vaelor Drax for 9 years. He had been in 3 full-scale military campaigns, 2 territorial suppressions, and 1 event that the official record listed as a border incident and that people who had survived it called by other names in private. He had seen apex shifters manifest before. He understood, professionally and academically, what bloodline awakening looked like. He had never seen anything that looked like this. The light came first. Not fire, not electricity. Something between those things and neither of them. A white luminescence that originated somewhere in the space between Seris Vale's shoulder blades and expanded outward through the room the way sound expands through water, in all directions simultaneously, without preference, without pause. It found every corner. It found the ceiling. It found Kaelin's face and the folder of documents he was still holding and the far wall and Vaelor, who had not stepped back. Vaelor had not moved at all. This was the thing about Vaelor Drax that even 9 years of proximity had not entirely demystified. His relationship to danger was not the relationship of a man who had conquered fear. It was the relationship of a man who had integrated fear so completely into his operational baseline that it no longer produced the conventional response of withdrawal. He stood in the center of that expanding light with his jaw set and his eyes tracking and the expression of a man who is running calculations at speed on a problem that keeps producing results he finds significant. Seris was on her feet. She did not remember standing up. That was the honest truth of it, and she was a woman who insisted on honest truths even when, especially when, they were disorienting. One moment she had been seated against the headboard with Lucien's treatment cooling the burning in her arm, and then the burning had reached her spine, and then there was light, and then she was standing in the center of the penthouse with the mountain wind moving through her hair and the documents scattered across the floor, and both her feet planted on the cold marble with a steadiness that her body had never possessed before. Not the steadiness of training, the steadiness of something that had always been there, waiting for the suppressant to stop silencing it. She looked at her hands. They were hers. Same hands she had used to carry trays and scrub floors and wrap bruises in stolen linen for 22 years. The same hands that bore the calluses and the old, small scars of years of domestic labor. But the light was in them, pooling in her palms like water finding its level and receding now, pulling back inward as whatever had erupted found its new boundaries and settled. The room was very still. Lucien had his back against the far wall. Kaelin had his 3 steps of distance. Vaelor had not moved. "Seris," he said. She looked up. The gold eyes were doing something she had no previous data for. Not fear, that was the first thing she checked, because fear was the response she was conditioned to expect from people witnessing her existence become inconvenient. Not excitement either, which was the secondary response she might have anticipated from a man of his particular breed of power encountering something novel. It was something more specific than either of those things. Something that sat between recognition and the particular gravity of a man who has just received information that changes the shape of the thing he thought he was looking at. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No." "Are you—" He stopped, reconsidered the question. "What are you feeling right now?" She thought about lying. The habit was there, deeply grooved, automatic. Then she thought about 22 years of lying about how she felt in order to remain manageable, and she thought about the documents on the floor, and she thought about the word Wyrm Silver and what it meant in her body for a decade, and she said, like something just finished holding its breath. Vaelor looked at her for a long moment. "Good," he said. This was not what she expected him to say. She expected assessment. She expected the machinery of power engaging with the new variable she represented, what she was, what she could do, how she could be useful or dangerous, or both. That was how the world worked. That was how it had always worked in her experience. A person's value was determined by what they could be made to produce or controlled to suppress. Vaelor said good, and then he crossed the room toward her, and what he did next was not what she expected either. He did not touch her. He stopped 2 feet away and stood there, in the mountain wind coming through the destroyed walls, and he said, "Whatever just woke up in you, that belongs to you. Nobody in this room is going to tell you what to do with it." She looked at him. "You're a king," she said. "Yes. Kings tell people what to do." "Sometimes," he said. "Not tonight." There was a silence. Not the kind she was used to, not loaded, not threatening, not the pressure silence of someone waiting for her to fail. A different kind. The kind that has room in it. Kaelin cleared his throat. "We have a more immediate problem," he said. "The seismic event registered. Every delegation in that ballroom felt it. Word is already moving through the building." Vaelor did not look away from Seris. "What are people saying?" he said. 3 theories: structural issue with the mountain, mechanical failure in the sublevels, or— Kaelin paused. Bloodline manifestation. Who's pushing the 3rd theory? Lord Corvin's advisors, specifically. Now Vaelor looked away from her. There was the shift she had been waiting for. Not dramatic, not a visible change of expression, just a settling of something in his jaw and his shoulders, like a building settling onto its foundation before a storm. She had watched powerful men process threat information before, and had learned to read the quality of their responses the way she read everything, carefully, from a safe distance, cataloging for future use. What she read in Vaelor Drax was not anger managing itself. What she read was something colder and more structural than anger. It was the response of a man who has been keeping an account for a long time and has just discovered the final entry. "Corvin knows what she is," Vaelor said. "He's known her entire life," Kaelin said. "That's the whole architecture." "Then he also knows what tonight means." "He's already moving, sir. I have 3 people downstairs. His delegation requested a private audience with the Imperial Concord steward approximately 6 minutes after the event. They're framing it as a welfare inquiry, concern for a servant who collapsed." Seris said, "He'll bury the documents." Both men looked at her. She said it again, not because they hadn't heard her, but because she needed to hear herself say it in a room where the saying of it would produce something other than silence. "He'll go after the documentation first. He's done it before. He has contacts in 3 record offices that I know of because I was the one carrying the correspondence when I was 16, and I was too young to understand what I was looking at, but I memorized it because I memorize everything, because memorizing things was the only kind of insurance I had." A beat of silence. "Which 3 offices?" Kaelin said. She told him. He was already moving toward the door while she finished the second name. Vaelor watched him go. Then he turned back to her, and she saw the adjustment in his face, the same recalibration she had caught before, the one that told her he was taking in new information and revising. She was not, she realized, what he had thought she was when he picked her off the ballroom floor. She had not been what she thought she was either. They were both operating with updated intelligence, and the question was what to do with it. "You memorize correspondence," he said. "I memorize everything." "How much of it?" "Enough," she said. 11 years of enough. He stood there in the destroyed penthouse above the mountains and the mountain wind, and he looked at her with those gold eyes, and she looked back at him without dropping her gaze, which was something she had not done with anyone in authority since she was approximately 12 years old and had learned the cost of it. She did not drop it now. He was the first one to speak. "Then we need to move," he said, "before he does. Here is the thing about kings that popular mythology consistently misunderstands. The crown does not make a man dangerous. The crown is the thing worn by a man who was already dangerous before the crowning. Sovereignty is not a grant of power. It is a recognition of power that already existed, and the machinery of recognition is far less important than the machinery of the power itself. A king stripped of his title and his court and his armies is still the thing he was before those things were added, and that thing does not require ceremony to operate." Vaelor Drax had been 17 when he first understood this. He had been in a cell in the Vareth borderlands, captured by the faction that killed his father, and the men holding him had believed that removing him from the infrastructure of his dominion would remove him from any effective threat calculation. They had made the fundamental error of confusing the symbol with the substance. He had been out of the cell in 36 hours. The faction had been resolved within the year. He thought about this now, not with sentimentality, but with the specific practical clarity of a man who has learned to use his own history as a reference document. What he was about to do in the next several hours would determine not just the outcome of this summit, but the structural integrity of everything he had spent the past decade building. A claim like Seris Vale represented, because that was her name, and he had decided in the penthouse with the documents on the floor that it would be her name, and that he was going to say it until the room knew it. A claim like that, surfaced publicly and backed with documented evidence, had the potential to collapse 3 layers of political infrastructure that Corvin Ashmore had spent 20 years constructing. Corvin would fight. He would fight ugly. He would fight the way men fight when they have more to lose than their pride. When they have built their entire identity and legacy on a foundation that someone else just walked up to and started dismantling from underneath. What Vaelor needed to decide, in the next 90 seconds before he walked out of this penthouse and back into the arena of it, was how much of the fight he was willing to conduct through official channels and how much of it was going to require him to be the 17-year-old in the cell. He looked at Seris. She was already pulling the linen from her arm. "You don't need that anymore?" Lucian said carefully. "The wound should—" "I know." She set the linen on the bed. The wound had already begun to close, not at natural healing speed, at the other speed, the one that happened when bloodline mechanisms were finally operating without pharmaceutical interference. She looked at it with the expression of a woman cataloging a fact rather than marveling at it. Then she looked up. "How much time do we have before Corvin gets to the steward?" 20 minutes, Vaelor said. "Maybe less. Then we need to get down there before he sets the frame." "We." She met his eyes. "He stole my house," she said, my name, my entire life. Whatever happens in that room tonight, I am going to be in it. Not because you carried me there, because I have been waiting 22 years and I am done waiting." The silence after that was very short. "Yes," Vaelor said. He said it the way he said everything, without hedging, without qualification, without the performative consideration that men in power typically deploy when they are about to agree to something significant. He just said yes, and that was the whole of it. Then he moved toward the door, and she moved with him. Lucian started to say something about rest and recovery and bloodline stabilization timelines. Neither of them slowed down. The stairwell was cold and utilitarian in the specific way that all the infrastructure beneath palace ceremony is cold and utilitarian, stripped of ornament, honest in its architecture, built for function rather than impression. Vaelor moved through it with the particular quality of a man who has internalized spatial awareness as a survival tool, not rushed, not wary, simply present in his own movement in a way that left no room between intention and action. Seris kept pace. This was not a small thing. She was 22, recently poisoned in the first hours of a bloodline awakening that had been suppressed for a decade, and she was keeping pace with a man who had been physically conditioning himself for military operation since he was old enough to train. The fact of it did not register as remarkable to either of them in the moment, which was its own form of remarkableness. They moved like two people whose bodies had decided, without consulting their respective histories, that this was a natural configuration. 2 floors down, the stairwell opened onto a service corridor, and the service corridor connected to the lower wing of the palace administrative level, and the administrative level was where the Imperial Concord steward maintained his offices. Where the administrative level also connected to the ballroom's back approach, where Lord Corvin Ashmore was currently moving through with 2 advisors and the particular velocity of a man who has identified the window in which the narrative can still be controlled and is committed to reaching it before anyone else. They met in the corridor. It was not staged. There was no audience. Just corridor stone and lantern light in the 4 of them, Corvin with his 2 advisors, Vaelor with Seris beside him, and the specific quality of air between people who are all fully aware that what happens in the next 2 minutes will determine everything that happens for years after. Corvin stopped. He looked at Seris with the expression she had seen on his face for most of her life. The one that assessed her the way a man assesses property that has done something inconvenient. Then he looked at Vaelor. "Your Majesty." His voice was perfectly calibrated. That was the thing about Corvin. He was never undone by surprise in the first 3 seconds. 3 seconds was the window in which he shifted from reaction to management. "I was on my way to offer my household's assistance. We were concerned about—" "Were you," Vaelor said. Flat. 2 words, no qualification. Corvin's recalibration was visible only in the slight adjustment of his weight distribution, almost imperceptible. Seris caught it because she knew what to look for. "She is under the care of my household," Corvin said. "Any medical situation involving a servant in my—" "She isn't your servant," Vaelor said. The corridor was very quiet. "Your Majesty, with respect, the documentation clearly—" "Forged," Vaelor said. 7 signatures. "You had good people doing it. Not good enough." Corvin was silent for 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, Seris watched him run through the variables. She could see it, not metaphorically, but almost literally, the way you can see machinery operating through a glass panel. He was calculating exposure. He was measuring how much Vaelor actually had versus how much he was claiming to have. He was assessing whether the forgery could survive scrutiny, whether the record offices had been reached yet, whether there was a path through this that preserved the essential structure of what he had built. He arrived at an answer. The answer was not retreat. "You've had an extraordinary evening, sir," Corvin said, and the shift in his tone was so smooth it was almost admirable, from defensive to concerned, from cornered to compassionate, managing the reframe with the reflexive skill of 30 years of political practice. "A servant collapsed at the summit. You responded with admirable attention, but I would caution," he let the word carry weight without raising his voice, "against making significant claims based on what may be a combination of medical incident and documentation confusion. The bloodline registries are complex, and a young woman who has been unwell. I'm standing right here," Seris said. It came out quiet. It landed hard. Corvin looked at her. There was something in his face, for the first time in her memory, that was not management, not performance. Something beneath those things, something he had kept below the surface for so long it was almost vestigial, almost forgotten even by himself, but not entirely. Fear, not of what she could do to him physically. She hadn't shifted, hadn't displayed anything beyond the steadiness of her presence and the flatness of her gaze. The fear was of something else. The fear was of the specific, precise terror that belongs to people who have built elaborate systems of control when they encounter the object of that control looking at them without the expected deference, without the flinching, without the automatic downward cast of eyes that has been trained into place over years of careful, methodical work. Seris Vale looked at Lord Corvin Ashmore the way you look at something you are deciding what to do with. And Lord Corvin Ashmore, for all his 30 years of sophisticated cruelty, recognized that look, because it was his look. He had deployed it for decades. He knew what it meant when it appeared on a face that was not supposed to possess it. It meant the calculation had changed. "You put it in my food," she said. "Every day for 10 years you put it in my food. You forged my family out of existence. You took everything that existed before I was old enough to understand what existing meant." She paused. "I want you to know that I remember all of it. Every document I carried, every correspondence I was supposed to be too young to read, every conversation I heard through walls because invisible people hear everything." Another pause. "I've been memorizing you for 11 years, Corvin. Every lie, every name, every contact." She tilted her head, and the movement was almost imperceptible, but it was there. "How much of it do you think is still in the record offices? And how much of it do you think is already somewhere you can't reach?" The advisors looked at each other. Corvin's face did something complex. "You," he said, and the calibration in his voice failed for exactly one syllable, "have no standing in this Valecrest," Vaelor said. Clean, definitive. "Her name is Seris Vale, House Valecrest, documented and living, and everything you built on the assumption of its extinction is going to be disassembled according to the law of this Concord, starting tonight." He moved one step forward. Just one. He did not need more than one. "You will return to your suite. Your delegation will be confined to the East Wing pending full review. Any attempt to contact record offices, advisory contacts, or external parties will be treated as evidence tampering." A pause. "You understand me?" Not a question. Corvin stood in the lantern light, and he was 63 years old, and he had the silver hair and the physical bearing of a man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. And he was being told no now in a corridor that no one had been meant to use tonight, by a king and a woman he had spent 22 years trying to make into nothing, and the architecture of his face, the precise, practiced, expensive architecture of political composure, was working very hard to hold its shape. It was holding, but only just. "You're making a significant error," he said. "No," Vaelor said. "I'm correcting one." Corvin looked at Seris one more time. She did not look away. He turned and walked back up the corridor. His advisors followed. The three of them disappeared around the corner, and for a moment the corridor was just stone and lantern light and silence, and Seris became aware that she had been holding every muscle in her body at a particular tension and that she could now, carefully, release some portion of it. She exhaled. It was not a shaking exhale. She was proud of that. It was just a breath. Long and deliberate and real. "The record offices," Vaelor said, not looking at her, but at the corner where Corvin had gone. "Kaelin will have them," she said. "He will." A pause. "You were right to read that fast." "I had 11 years of practice reading him." Vaelor turned. He looked at her with an expression that was harder to categorize than any of the ones she had seen on his face in the last 2 hours, which was already a significant collection. "What do you need right now?" he said. She thought about it. This was not a question she was accustomed to being asked. The honest answer was complicated and multi-layered and involved several years of architecture being dismantled over the course of a single evening, and the physical reality of a body that was still integrating a fundamental change, and the cognitive reality of a woman who had just discovered that her entire life had been built on a theft, and was now trying to determine what the actual foundation beneath the theft looked like. "I need the evidence in front of the full council," she said, "tonight, before anything gets buried or reframed or moved." "The council doesn't convene until the formal session. Then call an emergency session." He looked at her. "You want to do this tonight," he said. "I've been waiting 22 years, she said. "I'm not waiting until morning." There are moments in the exercise of power that separate the people who understand authority from the people who only perform it. Performance authority requires procedure, requires setting, requires the validation of institutional context to feel legitimate. Real authority requires none of those things. Real authority is the capacity to look at a situation and say, this needs to happen now, and then make it happen regardless of whether the calendar agrees. Vaelor Drax had been exercising real authority since he was 17 years old in a cell. He looked at Seris Vale standing in a service corridor in a soot-stained uniform that was not hers, with a healed wound on her arm and light still faintly visible in the lines of her palms if you knew what you were looking for, and he made a decision the way he made all decisions. Without ceremony, without the performance of deliberation, with the flat precision of a man who has done the calculation and arrived at the answer and is now simply implementing it. "Give me 20 minutes, he said. He pulled his communicator. She listened to him give 3 separate instructions to 3 separate people in under 4 minutes, and she noted, with the part of her mind that had been cataloging how power operated since she was old enough to understand the difference between power and performance, that he gave each instruction once, not twice. He did not repeat himself to anyone, and nobody asked him to. The instructions were clear, specific, and complete, and they produced results the way physical forces produce results, directly, without negotiation with the material. The council chamber was ready at 9:47. They walked in together. The 12 members of the Imperial Concord High Council were not pleased to be in an emergency session. This was visible in a dozen different ways: the quality of their attention, the set of their posture, the particular resentment of people who have been pulled from their calculations mid-calculation. Several of them were still holding drinks from the reception. One had a serving of food he had carried from the ballroom with the defiant determination of a man who has decided that if he is being summoned to an emergency council, he is at minimum going to finish his dinner. Nysra Ashmore was in the observation gallery. She had positioned herself with the precision of a woman who understood spatial communication. Third position from the left, which put her in the eye line of 4 council members without appearing to be performing for them. She was still in the sapphire silk. She had not removed the ornamental knife from her belt. Seris saw her. Nysera saw Seris. The gallery was elevated, and from below, Nysera had the angle advantage, looking down, Seris looking up, which was the physical grammar of their entire relationship rendered architecturally. 22 years of that grammar. Seris noted it. She filed it. She walked to the center of the chamber floor. Kaelin had arrived before them and had the documentation organized on the evidence table with the efficiency of a man who had been doing this kind of work for a long time and had stopped being impressed by the drama of it. He met Vaelor's eyes when they entered and gave a single nod that communicated, "It's there, it's solid, and I've already contacted 2 of the 3 record offices." Vaelor did not take the central position. This was noted by every person in the room. The central position in the Imperial Concord chamber was traditionally occupied by the highest-ranking monarch present, and Vaelor Drax was unambiguously that person. His failure to occupy it was not absent-mindedness. It was language. He stood to the side, slightly behind Seris, and the positioning said something that made the council members shift in their seats and recalculate. The lead counselor, an elderly woman named Tyreth Mause, who had been on the High Council for 24 years and had seen enough political theater to be essentially immune to it, looked at Seris with the flat assessment of someone conducting a professional appraisal. The emergency session was called at the request of His Majesty King Vaelor Drax of Stormfang, Tyreth said. The matter before the council is described as a bloodline legitimacy claim with associated evidence of fraud and criminal suppression. She folded her hands. The claimant is identified as Seris Vale, servant to House Ashmore. She paused. Is the claimant present? I'm present, Seris said. And the claimant's position? My name is Seris Vale, she said. House Vale. I have been alive for 22 years. The documentation that says otherwise is forged. Tyreth looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a woman who has been lied to by very sophisticated people many times and has developed extremely accurate detection mechanisms for lies of the sophisticated variety. Evidence, she said. Kaelin began. He was methodical and devastating in the way that good strategists are when they present factual cases. No editorializing, no dramatic inflection, just sequence and implication, letting the documentation do the weight-bearing work and trusting that the weight was sufficient. The forged signatures, the financial transfers, the estate acquisition papers, the Wyram silver procurement records, because Corvin had been careful, but not careful enough, and what Kaelin had found in the Ashmore financial documentation was a 17-year record of compound acquisition that corresponded precisely with Seris's age and with the suppression timeline Lucien had calculated. The council chamber got very quiet around the fifth piece of evidence. By the eighth, the man who had been eating his dinner had set it down. Nicera, in the gallery, had gone very still. Then Lord Corvin entered. He had not been confined to his suite. This was immediately apparent from the fact of his presence, which meant either that Vaelor's instruction had been superseded, or that Corvin had a contact within the palace administration willing to facilitate his movement despite a direct royal order. Either possibility was significant data. He came through the gallery access, not the floor entrance, the gallery, and he stood beside Nicera and he looked down at the chamber below with an expression that had completed its recalibration. He had made a decision. Seris could see it from the floor. The particular quality of a man who has stopped managing toward a solution and started managing toward a controlled collapse, figuring out what can be sacrificed to protect the core. He was going to give them something. He was going to give them something and shape what he gave them and work with whatever remained. "Councillor Moss," he called down from the gallery. Every head turned. "I would like to address the session," he said. Tyrath looked at Vaelor. Vaelor said nothing. Tyrath looked at Seris. Seris said, "Let him." She said it because she wanted him in the room. She wanted him in the room because everything she knew about how he operated told her that the moment Corvin Ashmore believed he was controlling the frame, he expanded. He could not resist it. 30 years of successful manipulation had taught him that every room was a room he could manage. And that belief, the fundamental certainty of it, the way it had become structural rather than strategic, was the most reliable vulnerability he possessed. Corvin came down to the floor. He addressed the council with the measured, regretful authority of a man confessing to a minor procedural irregularity. "There were documentation irregularities in the Valecrest acquisition," he said. "I was made aware of them some years ago, and I regret that the correction was not expedited. The girl, the young woman, has been in my care in good faith, and any perceived deficiencies in that care are a product of household management oversights, not deliberate." "You put worm silver in her food," Vaelor said. The room temperature dropped. "That is for 10 years, Vaelor said. 17 years of procurement documentation. Compound acquisition, beginning the year she arrived in your household at age 8. Consistent with suppression protocol for an awakening apex bloodline." He was not shouting. He was not performing. He was delivering information with the flat, immovable quality of a man who has decided that the information will be heard and that the only variable is how many times it needs to be delivered before that outcome is achieved. This is not a documentation irregularity. This is a criminal architecture. You identified an heir, you buried the heir alive, and managed the burial for 22 years. Corvin looked at him, then at the council, then, slowly, at Seris, and she saw him arrive at the decision she had been waiting for him to arrive at from the moment he walked into the gallery. The decision that meant the conversation was about to stop being about documents and records and legal instruments and become something else entirely. He shifted, not fully. Not the complete transition, just the first warning of it, the physical precursor, the micro-transformation that preceded the full biological declaration. His outline changed at the jaw and the shoulders. His eyes changed color. He was not attempting to negotiate anymore. He was attempting to end the conversation in the way that apex predators end conversations when they have run out of language. "Don't," Vaelor said. One word, absolute. Corvin did not stop. Later, when Seris tried to reconstruct the sequence of the following 20 seconds with the precision she applied to everything she needed to understand, she found that her memory did not cooperate the way she expected it to. Not because the events were traumatic. She had processed traumatic events with functional clarity her entire life. But because what happened in those 20 seconds had a quality that her analytical mind did not yet have the right framework to hold. Corvin completed the shift into his war form, a massive gray wolf, battle weight, carrying the muscle memory of 3 military campaigns and the specific aggression of a man who has decided that the only remaining option is destruction. And he cleared the distance between them with a velocity that bypassed every normal warning the human mind uses to calculate danger and build response. She felt the heat return, not the fever heat, Not the burning of suppression, something else. Something that came from below the floor of her body, from the place that had been waiting, and it did not feel like ignition. It felt like recognition. Her body moved before her mind authorized it. Every person in the chamber saw what happened next. Nobody moved. There was a white wolf standing on the chamber floor. She did not know how long she had been shifted. She did not know the sequence of the change, or whether she had experienced it as pain or as something else. What she knew was that she was four-legged, and the chamber ceiling was much higher than it had been a moment ago, and Corvin's gray form was circling her in the tight, calculating pattern of a predator assessing its target. He struck. She met him, and in the collision, she discovered the answer to the question that 22 years of suppression had prevented her from knowing: what she was, what the Valecrest bloodline actually produced in its undiluted form, in a body that had been carrying it unbroken through every year of starvation and cruelty and the compound in her food. What she was enough, more than enough, she was more than enough, and she had always been more than enough. And the only reason she had not known it was because someone had spent 22 years and extraordinary resources making sure she didn't. The gray wolf pinned. The chamber was silent. Then Vaelor was beside her, not between her and Corvin, beside her, his hand at the back of her neck, not restraining, not directing, just present. And she felt through the contact that he was not alarmed. He was not alarmed, and he was not surprised, and he was not calculating how to use what she was or how to contain it. He was just there. She looked at the council. 12 faces, 12 different expressions, all of them arriving by different routes at the same destination. Tyreth Mosse, who had been on the High Council for 24 years and was essentially immune to political theater, looked at the white wolf standing in the center of the chamber floor and said, in the voice of a woman making a formal notation, "The bloodline marker is confirmed." And in the gallery above, Nysera Ashmore gripped the railing and looked down at the sisters she had spent 22 years treating as furniture, and her face did something it had never done before in any room Seris had been present in. It broke. Not with grief, with the specific terror of a woman who has built an empire of cruelty on a foundation she just watched turn to dust, and who understands, with total clarity, that the person standing in the rubble was the one she put there. Corvin was down. The chamber was making a sound that was not quite silence and not quite noise, the sound of 300 years of political infrastructure processing a fundamental revision. Vaelor stood beside the white wolf in the center of it. He did not look at the council. He did not look at Corvin. He looked at her. And then, in front of the 12 members of the Imperial Concord High Council, and the gallery observers and the guards at the doors, and the full apparatus of a political world that had just watched everything it thought it knew about itself get rearranged, he said, "Now we begin." It was not until Seris was human again, standing in the chamber with the mountain air cold on her skin and the light still visible in her palms, and Tyreth Mosse formally requesting her sworn testimony for the record, that she registered what she had heard in Vaelor's voice when he said those words. Not possession. She had been listening for possession, for the particular note of a powerful man encountering something valuable and deciding it was his. She had been listening for it because she was a woman who had spent her entire life having things decided for her, and old vigilance does not retire just because the immediate threat has changed. What she heard instead was something she had no reliable data point for. What she heard was a man who had just watched someone he'd underestimated all evening turn out to be something he had never encountered before. And instead of finding that threatening, instead of calculating how to manage it, he had said, "Now we begin. Not I will lead you. Not I will use you. We." She filed it. She would examine it later, when the council session was over and the documentation was secured, and Corvin was formally confined and the immediate architecture of survival had been attended to. She would examine it later. But she kept it somewhere close while she turned to face Tyreth Mosse and the full Concord Council, and prepared, for the first time in her life, to tell the truth about everything. Outside the palace, the mountain held its breath. Inside, in the administrative corridor where the night had detonated, a junior guard was relaying the contents of the chamber to the rest of the palace staff through the communication chain that ran from post to post through service corridors and back passages. The invisible infrastructure of a palace that was always watching, always listening, always carrying information through channels that the nobility preferred to pretend did not exist. The message moved fast. By the time it reached the East Wing, where Nicera Ashmore had been escorted by 2 of Kaelin's people and asked, firmly, to remain, it had already been amended 3 times by 3 different voices, each one adding something, each addition carrying the weight of people who had been serving at the bottom of a very old hierarchy and who understood, without needing it explained, exactly what tonight meant. Nicera received it in her room. She was still in the sapphire silk. She sat on the bed in the East Wing room and she listened to the message, and then she sat very still for a long time. Then she stood up. She went to the desk. She wrote a single document in her own hand, precise, brief, in the formal language of legal declaration, and she sealed it with her ring and she set it face down on the desk. And then she opened the East Wing window, and the mountain air came in cold and absolute. And Nicera Ashmore, who had spent 25 years being the most dangerous woman in every room she entered, looked out at the frozen cliffs and understood that the room had changed. She looked down at the courtyard below. 12 stories. Her hand was on the window frame. Nicera's hand was on the window frame for 11 seconds. Seris knew this because she was counting, had been counting from the moment Kaelin's report reached her in the council antechamber with the specific flatness of a man delivering information he hoped she already understood the weight of. 11 seconds. That was how long Nicera Ashmore had stood at an open window 12 stories above the courtyard, before she stepped back, closed it, and sat down on the floor of the East Wing room with her back against the wall and her knees drawn up and the sealed document still on the desk above her head. The guard outside the door had not been told what to listen for. He had been told to listen. He was good at his job. Seris arrived at the East Wing at 10:53 in the evening, still in the uniform that was not hers, with light in her palms that came and went like breath. Kaelin had wanted to send someone else. Vaelor had started to come himself. She had told both of them, with the particular economy of a woman who has already spent too many words tonight and has identified exactly which conversation belongs to her. This one is mine. The guard opened the door without being asked. Nicera was still on the floor. The sapphire silk was pooled around her like water that had stopped moving, and she looked. This was the part that Seris had not prepared for. She looked like someone who had been carrying something enormous for a very long time and had just set it down and discovered that she did not know how to stand up without it. Not defeated. Not broken in the way that Corvin had been broken, which was the breaking of a structure collapsing under external force. This was something internal, something that had been load-bearing and was no longer required to bear anything. Seris stepped into the room. She did not close the door. She left it open, which was a decision because open doors meant witnesses, and right now she needed what happened in this room to exist in a space larger than just the two of them. Nicera looked up. Her eyes were dry. That was the first thing Seris registered. She had expected tears or the controlled absence of tears. What she found instead was an expression she had not seen on Nicera's face before, which was remarkable given how long she had spent studying that face for threats. It was the expression of someone who has looked directly at a thing they spent years not looking at and has found that it is exactly as bad as they suspected, and somehow worse. "I thought you were asleep," Nicera said. Her voice was flat. Not flat from performance, flat from exhaustion. "What?" Seris said. "The compound." Nicera looked at the window. "The Wyrm silver. I told myself you were asleep in there, that it was containment, that it wasn't the same as—" She stopped. It was exactly the same. Seris stood in the doorway of the East Wing room, and she held very still the way she had learned to hold still at 9 years old when the house was dangerous and motion attracted attention. "You knew," she said. "Not all of it." Nicera's hands were in her lap. She was looking at them. "I knew about the compound. I knew about the suppression. I didn't know about the bloodline documentation until—" She stopped again. "That's not true. I knew there was documentation he'd managed. I didn't ask what kind." A pause. "I didn't ask because I didn't want to know, because I already knew enough to understand that asking would make me responsible for what I already knew." The room was very quiet. There are specific silences that belong to the moment between accusation and acknowledgement. They have a texture distinct from other silences. Neither comfortable nor aggressive, just raw, like a surface stripped of its finish. Seris had spent most of her life in the silences that came before acknowledgement, in the space where she had said or implied a truth, and was waiting for the room to decide whether it was going to let the truth exist or suffocate it. This was the first time she had been in the silence after. "Your blade," Seris said. "Yes. Tonight." "Yes." That wasn't the first time. Nicera looked up. "No," she said. "It wasn't." Here is what Seris had understood about Nicera Ashmore for years. In the careful, private way she understood everything that threatened her survival. Nicera was not cruel the way Corvin was cruel. Corvin's cruelty was architectural, built into his plans, load-bearing, structural. It served purposes. It was efficient. Nicera's cruelty was different. It was the cruelty of a woman who had been taught from childhood that power was expressed through dominance over others, and who had applied that lesson with the particular intensity of someone trying to prove to herself that the lesson was correct. People who hurt others to prove a lesson to themselves are not doing it because it satisfies them. They are doing it because they are afraid of what it means if they stop. Seris had known this for years. She had kept it behind the walls alongside the anger, because knowing it was a form of weakness she could not afford. Understanding the architecture of someone's cruelty does not protect you from it. It just means you're carrying two things instead of one. "My father is going to lose everything," Nicera said. "Yes. The title, the estates, the dynasty." She said each one with the flat precision of a woman taking inventory. "Everything he built." "Everything he stole," Seris said. Nicera was quiet. "Yes," she said finally. "Everything he stole." The admission sat in the room between them. Seris looked at the sealed document on the desk. "What's in it?" she said. Nicera followed her gaze. "A confession," Nicera said. "My own, separate from my father's. What I knew, when I knew it, what I did with the knowledge." She paused. "It's addressed to Counselor Mos." Seris looked at her. "Why?" she said. "Because I had 11 seconds at that window to decide what kind of person I was going to be for whatever time I have left," Nicera said, "and I found out I was not actually willing to be the kind that—" She stopped. "I found out something I didn't expect to find out." "What?" "That I don't want to disappear." It came out rough, unpolished, nothing like Nicera's usual register. "I've spent 25 years being everything my father needed me to be, performing whatever the room required, disappearing into it, and at that window I understood that if I stepped off, nobody would miss the performance. There's no one there to miss." She looked at Seris with something that was almost terrible in its honesty. "But you would notice, because you notice everything. And She stopped. "I am tired of only existing in the sight of someone who fears me." The room held that. Seris thought about it. She thought about it with the same deliberate honesty she applied to everything she examined, which meant sitting with the discomfort of a complicated truth rather than resolving it into something simpler and more manageable. Nicera Ashmore had spent 22 years making her life smaller, more painful, more invisible. There was no version of a clean account that changed that fact. There was no confession that retroactively removed the cuts or the compound or the years of deliberate cruelty deployed to keep Seris in a position of manageable suffering. And in this room, right now, the woman who had done all of that was sitting on the floor, having produced the single most honest thing she had likely said in years. And Seris was the only person in the building who was going to decide what it meant. "Give me the document," Seris said. Nicera looked up. "I'll take it to Mos myself," Seris said. "You'll testify when called, everything you knew, everything you did. The council decides what happens after that." She paused. "But you don't disappear." Nicera stared at her. "Why?" she said. "Because disappearing is what my family was supposed to do," Seris said. "And I'm done with that as a solution." She picked up the document from the desk. She left the room. She did not look back. This was not forgiveness. Seris understood the difference, with the precision of someone who has had to think carefully about what forgiveness means and what it costs, and who it actually serves when it is given. Forgiveness was a process with a timeline she could not calculate tonight in a corridor at 11 in the evening. What she had just done was something different. It was the refusal to allow another person's destruction to be the price of her survival. She had seen enough of that accounting. She was not going to run her life on it. She was halfway down the corridor when Kaelin found her. His face was doing the thing it did when he had information he needed to deliver at speed and was calculating how to deliver it with maximum accuracy and minimum damage. She stopped walking. "Tell me," she said. "The East Record Office," he said. "What about it?" "It was reached." The corridor was cold. "When?" she said. "Approximately 40 minutes ago, before my contact could get there." His jaw was tight. "Someone moved faster than we calculated. The primary Valecrest bloodline registry has been altered. Not destroyed, but altered. If it's accepted as the authoritative record, the bloodline markers Lucian documented tonight would be classified as anomalous. Secondary data. Contestable." Seris processed this. "Who?" she said. Kaelin looked at her. "That's the part I need you to hear carefully," he said. "There are moments in the exercise of power that separate the people who understand authority from the people who only perform it, and Kaelin Morvain was one of the clearest examples Seris had encountered of the former category. He did not soften what he was about to say. He did not frame it or contextualize it or provide it with the cushioning language that people deploy when they are trying to make information more receivable. He had decided, in the way that precise men decide things, that she deserved the information in its actual form. "The contact in the East Record Office," he said, "has been on Stormfang payroll for 6 years." The corridor did not change. The lantern light did not change. Seris's face did not change. But something happened in the 2 seconds after Kaelin said that. Something internal, something in the place where she kept the anger and the walls and the carefully maintained architecture of her own survival. That was not anger and was not fear, and was not the familiar compression of pain being managed before it could become visible. It was the specific cold shock of understanding that the floor you were standing on was not the floor you thought you were standing on. "Someone in Vaelor's organization," she said. "Yes. Someone who knew about the record offices because I told Vaelor, who told Kaelin, who—" "The communication was in a closed channel," Kaelin said. 4 people had access. Myself, His Majesty, the duty strategist, and—" He stopped. "The third-tier intelligence coordinator, Ren Cavell. He's been with us for 4 years. Where is he now?" "We're looking." Corridor was quiet. Seris thought about the thing Vaelor had said to her in the penthouse, in the mountain wind through the destroyed walls, about the crown being liability wrapped in gold, about delayed decisions becoming wounds paid by others. He had said it with the weight of a man who had been carrying that particular truth for a long time, and she had heard in it the specific sound of experience. Now she understood it from the other side. She had trusted the information chain. She had given Vaelor the record office names because she had made a decision, in the corridor with Corvin's retreating footsteps still audible, to operate as though trust was available to her. She had made that decision consciously, deliberately, after 22 years of operating as though it was not. And within 40 minutes of making it, someone inside the apparatus she had trusted had used the information she provided to do exactly the thing she had been trying to prevent. This was the specific structural cruelty of betrayal inside systems of power. It does not merely damage the immediate outcome. It reaches backward and contaminates the decision to trust at all. It turns the act of opening yourself into evidence of your own naivety, which is the thing it wants you to believe so that you never open yourself again. She was not going to let it believe that, but she was also not going to pretend it didn't hurt. "How damaged is the record?" she said. "The alteration is recent. Lucian's blood documentation is contemporary and clean. If we move to contest the record within the next 12 hours, before it enters the formal archive cycle, there's a strong case." Kaelin paused. "But the window is narrow." "How narrow?" "Dawn." Seris looked at the document in her hands. Nysera's confession. She thought about timing and resource and the specific math of a narrow window. "Get me in front of Tyrath Massa," she said. "Now, not morning, now. It's almost midnight." "I know what time it is." Kaelin looked at her for 1 second. Then he started moving. Vaelor was in the strategy room when she found him, which was a room she had not been in before. Utilitarian in the Stormfang manner, maps on every surface, the kind of organized information density that reflected a mind that thought spatially about power and its movements. He was at the primary table with 3 of his people, and he was in the middle of a sentence when she came through the door. And he stopped speaking and looked at her and read her face with the same systematic precision He applied to everything and arrived at the correct conclusion before she said a word. He looked at Kaelin, who had come in behind her. "How bad?" he said. "East Record Office. One of yours." A silence. "Ren," Vaelor said. It was not a question. Seris looked at him. "You suspected," she said. "I had indicators. 2 weeks ago. I was building the case before acting." His jaw shifted. "I moved too slowly." "The information I gave you tonight reached him." "Yes." He looked at her with the gold eyes, and there was something in them she had not seen before in their hours of operating together. Not regret in the soft sense, but the specific expression of a man taking full account of a failure that belongs to him, looking at it without flinching. "That's on me, not on you for trusting the channel." "It's on both of us," she said. "Me for assuming the channel was clean. You for not closing the gap in it before tonight." She set Nicera's document on his table. "But right now it doesn't matter whose fault it is because we have until dawn." He looked at the document, read the exterior, looked back at her. "Nicera," he said. "Her confession, separate from Corvin's exposure. It corroborates the suppression timeline with first-hand knowledge." She paused. "It's admissible as supplementary testimony. You went to her yourself." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Here is what power looks like when it is not performing. It is still. Not with the theatrical stillness of someone controlling their response for an audience. Genuinely still. In the way that things are still when they have arrived at a decision and the only thing remaining is implementation." Vaelor Drax at that map table in the Midnight Strategy Room was a man who had just received 3 pieces of information: the record alteration, the identity of the contact, and the fact that Seris had walked into the East Wing alone and come out with a document that could change the morning. And he was integrating all of it with the speed of someone who has spent his entire adult life making decisions under time pressure and has stopped experiencing that pressure as stress and started experiencing it as the natural condition of being alive. "The Concord archive cycle runs at dawn," he said. 6 hours. "Moss needs the supplementary testimony before then." "Kaelin is already moving." He looked at her. "You're running this," he said. It was not a power statement, it was an observation. And beneath the observation, if she was reading him correctly, and she was increasingly confident she was reading him correctly, it carried something else. Something that operated like recognition, like a man who has spent years in rooms where every person is performing a version of themselves optimized for his approval, encountering someone who is simply operating. "I'm running what belongs to me," she said. "You run the rest." "Ran. Your problem. The delegation pressure tomorrow. Your problem. The council session at 8. Ours," she said. The strategy room was quiet. The 3 Stormfang officers at the table were looking at the maps with the studied attention of people who have decided that the most professionally appropriate thing they can do right now is pretend they are not hearing this conversation. "Ours," Vaelor said. One word. No qualification. She picked up the document and left the room. Tyreth Moss received her at 11:47 and read Nicera's confession with the systematic attention of a woman who had spent 24 years on the High Council and had developed an extremely accurate sense of the difference between documents produced to manage a situation and documents produced because someone could no longer live with what they were managing. She read it twice. Then she set it down. "This changes the supplementary record," she said. "That's why I brought it tonight," Seris said. "The primary record was altered." "Yes." "You know about that?" "Yes." Mose looked at her for a long moment. The study was warm, fire-lit, with the specific warmth of a room that has been lived in for hours and has retained the heat of accumulated presence. It was the kind of warmth Seris associated with kitchens rather than council chambers, and she found, to her mild surprise, that she was grateful for it. "Sit down," Mose said. Seris sat. "You've had an extraordinary evening," Mose said. "I've had an extraordinary 22 years. Mose almost smiled. It was brief, and it was real. "The alteration can be contested," Mose said. "The window is narrow, but it exists. What I need from you tonight, before I can authorize the contest filing, is a sworn deposition covering the full timeline. From the beginning, every document you memorized, every contact you identified, Every piece of evidence you have direct first-hand knowledge of. She paused. It will take several hours. I have several hours, Seris said. It will be entered into the permanent Concord archive. Good. It will be public record. Good, Seris said again, and she meant it with the specific conviction of a woman who has spent her entire life being erased from records and is done with the experience. Every word of it, everything. I want it in the archive so permanently that no one with a contact in a record office can reach it. Mosa studied her. You understand that public record cuts both ways, Mosa said. Your history becomes everyone's access. My history has always been everyone's property, Seris said. At least this way, I'm the one who wrote it down. The deposition began at midnight. It ran for 4 hours and 20 minutes. Seris sat across from Tyreth Moss and she told the truth. All of it. Not the managed version, not the survivable version, not the version optimized to produce a specific outcome in the listener. The actual version. From the mat in the stone corridor at 9 years old, to the linen she stole for her bruises, to the compound she had been eating for 10 years without knowing what it was. From the correspondence she memorized at 16 to the names she had been keeping behind walls alongside the anger. She had been keeping inventory for 11 years. The inventory took 4 hours and 20 minutes to deliver. By the time she finished, the mountain outside Moss's study window had begun to change color. Not sunrise, not yet, but the particular deep blue that precedes it, when the darkness admits that morning is coming even before the light appears. Mosse signed the contest filing at 4:38. It entered the Concord system at 4:41. The archive cycle ran at 5. 19 minutes. They had 19 minutes to spare. Seris walked out of Mosse's study into the pre-dawn corridor, and she stood there for a moment with her back against the cold stone wall, and she let herself breathe. Just breathe. Not calculating, not managing, not running threat assessment on every shadow. Just the physical reality of lungs and air and a body that had made it through the night intact. The burning in her palms was faint now. Not gone. She understood it would not be gone, that it was part of what she was and would require understanding and practice and time, but faint, like a fire that has found its right size. Kaelin found her at 5:15. Ren Cavell, he said. Where? Taken into custody an hour ago, East Gate. He had documentation he was attempting to move out of the palace grounds. What documentation? Everything your deposition just superseded. Kaelin paused. He also had a communication cipher, the kind used for external relay. We're still decrypting. Who was he relaying to? Working on it. Seris was quiet. Kaelin, she said. Yes. Corvin had a contact inside Stormfang for 4 years. That means everything Vaelor did in that time was potentially visible. She looked at him. Every strategy, every alliance, every documented decision. Kaelin was very still. Yes, he said. Has Vaelor considered the scope of that? He's considering it now. She pushed off the wall. I need to be in that room, she said. He asked me to tell you. I know what he asked you to tell me. She was already moving. He asked you to tell me to rest. He was being considerate. It was wrong. Kaelin did not argue. He walked with her. The strategy room at dawn had a different quality than it had at midnight. The maps were the same, the table was the same. But the people in it had been working for hours, and the kind of exhaustion that produces clarity rather than confusion had set in. The stripped-back, essential-only cognitive state of people who have burned through everything non-essential and are operating on what remains. Vaelor was standing at the primary map. He had removed the military coat at some point. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow. The scar from his left eye to his ear was more visible in the flat dawn light than it had been in the penthouse the night before, and he looked like what he was, a man who had been in more high-pressure situations than most people experience in a lifetime and who had come out of each of them not undamaged but intact, which was not the same thing. He looked up when she came in. The filing went through, she said. I know. Ren is in custody. I know that too. You have a problem, she said. I have several problems. She went to the map, looked at the territories. 4 years of exposed strategy. If Corvin had been routing intelligence through Ren for that long, the Ashmore network had a picture of Stormfang's defensive and diplomatic architecture that was devastatingly comprehensive. every treaty in progress, every tension point, every relationship that existed because of what it appeared to be rather than what it was. Who knew you were going to be at this summit, she said. Every delegation. It was announced 6 months. Who knew specifically that you were going to be looking for something here? She turned to face him. You entered that ballroom and you went directly toward me. Kaelin said your advance team swept the space in the morning. That's not standard summit security suite behavior. You were looking for something specific. Who knew what? The strategy room was quiet. Vaelor looked at her. And here it was, the thing she had been building toward from the moment Kaelin said the name of Ren Kavel. The question that was not about tonight's specific damage, but about the shape of the damage, the architecture of it, because in her experience, damage of this kind was never isolated. The people who built systems of control for 22 years do not have one contact in one office. They have networks, and networks have centers. Someone told Corvin you were looking for Valacrest bloodline indicators, she said. That's why Nicera had the worm silver blade tonight. That's why she used it before the reception instead of after. She was running out of time. Vaelor was very still. Who in your court, she said, knew about Valacrest? The answer to that question was going to be the answer to everything. Because if Ren Kavel had been passing general strategic intelligence to Corvin's network for 4 years, the damage was significant but manageable. Strategy could be rebuilt. Alliances could be renegotiated. Gaps could be closed. But if someone had told Corvin specifically that Vaelor was looking for a surviving Valacrest heir, that the King of Stormfang had been quietly investigating the extinct bloodline for some period of time before tonight, then the question was not how much Corvin knew about Stormfang's strategy. The question was who else had been looking for her, and why, and whether they had found what they were looking for before she had found it herself. Vaelor looked at her across the map table in the pre-dawn light of the strategy room, and she watched him arrive at the same calculation she had just run, and she watched his face do the thing it did when a calculation produced a result he found significant. There are 2 people, he said, who knew I was looking for Valacrest bloodline indicators, outside of this room, outside of the people I trust completely. Who? One is in the Concord Diplomatic Corps, and the other, he was quiet for 2 seconds. 2 seconds, in this man's economy of time, was a long time. The other, Vaelor said, is the person who gave me the original intelligence that a surviving Valacrest heir might exist. Seris looked at him. Who gave you that intelligence? She said. Vaelor looked at the map, at the territories, at the expanse of the continent and its borders and its histories of conflict and alliance and the specific geography of power that had shaped every decision he had made in the last 4 years. His name is Edrin Voss, Vaelor said. He is the Senior Intelligence Coordinator for the Northern Concord. He has been my most reliable source of regional intelligence for 6 years. He is also the reason I came to this summit specifically looking for what I found. He paused. And if Corvin knew I was looking, then Edrin told him, Seris said. Or Edrin is Corvin's network, has been from the beginning. The room held the full weight of that. Here is the truth about betrayal that most accounts of it get wrong. The damage is not located in the moment of discovery. The damage is located in the retroactive contamination, the way discovery reaches backward through every decision made in trust and reclassifies it. 6 years of reliable intelligence becomes 6 years of curated intelligence. 6 years of Vaelor operating with confidence in his information becomes 6 years of Vaelor operating on a map drawn by his enemies. Every decision, every alliance, every moment of certainty. The ground under all of it had just shifted. Vaelor stood at his map table, and he did not show what this cost him. But she was watching with 22 years of experience reading concealed reactions on powerful faces, and she saw the micro-contraction across his jaw and the quality of stillness that was not composure, but the thing composure is built on top of when composure is the only option available. She thought about the 17-year-old in the cell. She thought about what it takes to be that person, and also this one. Voss is at the summit, Vaelor said. Yes. He has been in this building for 2 days. He looked up from the map. He knows the outcome of last night already. He knows Corvin is confined. He knows the record contest was filed. He knows what I am, she said. Yes? And he knows that you now know about Ren. Yes? Which means he knows his window is closing. Vaelor looked at her. If Voss moves before we can contain him, he said, the decryption of Wren's communication cipher becomes the only evidence chain we have. And cipher decryption takes time. We may not... Where is he housed? She said. West Wing, 4th floor. She was already moving toward the door. This was the moment. This specific point in a specific corridor at a specific hour of a morning that had not yet decided to be morning, where 22 years of accumulated survival encountered the first situation it had not prepared her for. Not danger. She had spent her life in danger. Not betrayal. She had spent her life in betrayal. The situation she had not prepared for was this: being the person who moved toward the thing instead of away from it. Being the person for whom the door opening was not escape, but engagement. Being the person who, when the architecture of everything shifted, did not retreat into the walls she had built, but walked through them. She had built those walls to survive. But walls built for survival will eventually become the thing that prevents you from living. She had 11 seconds at a window of her own tonight. She had chosen not to stop. She pulled open the door to the West Wing stairwell, and from somewhere above her in the pre-dawn dark of the palace, she heard footsteps, not moving toward her, moving down, fast. And in the cold stairwell air, beneath the mountain silence and the approaching light, she smelled something that her bloodline recognized before her mind did. Not rain, not cedar, nothing clean. Something chemical and recent and wrong. The kind of wrong that has a timer on it. She looked back at Vaelor in the doorway of the strategy room. He had heard it too. Their eyes met across the corridor. And Seris Vale, heir to a house that had been buried alive for 22 years, who had spent a single night dismantling the architecture of everything that had been done to keep her underground, made the only decision available to a person who has finally, after a very long time, decided to stop surviving and start living. She went up the stairs. The stairs were stone, and the stone was cold, and the footsteps above her were moving with the specific velocity of someone who has made a decision and is now in the mechanical process of executing it, past the point where reconsideration is available. Seris took the first flight in 4 strides. Her body was doing something she had not fully cataloged yet. The bloodline awareness that had woken in her overnight was not just light in her palms and steadiness in her feet. It was sensory. The chemical smell she had caught in the stairwell was sharper now, directional, and her mind was receiving information that bypassed normal analysis and delivered conclusions at a speed she was not accustomed to. Wolfbane derivative. Concentrated. The kind of concentration that was not incidental. The kind that had been prepared. She heard Vaelor on the stairs below her. She had not told him to follow. He had not asked permission. 2 people who have spent a night operating in the same direction develop a working language that requires no words. And what she heard in his footsteps was not pursuit and not protection, but something between those things. The sound of someone moving with you rather than after you. She did not slow down. 3rd flight. The West Wing 4th floor landing opened onto 2 corridor directions. East to guest suites. North to the administrative archive access, and at its far end a service door opening onto the exterior maintenance walkway. The footsteps above had stopped. That was worse than if they had continued. Seris stood on the landing and she let the bloodline awareness do what it had been doing all night. Provide information she had no other way to access. Raw, unprocessed, a decade of suppression stripped away in a single evening, operating on instinct and necessity the way all things operate when they are finally given room to exist. North Corridor. The smell was stronger here, not just wolfbane concentrate, something acrid and synthetic underneath it. Accelerant. The kind used in controlled demolitions. The kind that, in the right quantity, could compromise a structure at a specific point. The archive access. She understood it in the same instant she reached the door. The East Record Office alteration had been the first move. This was the contingency. If the contest filing went through, if the documentation survived the night intact, then Edrin Voss had one remaining option: burn the physical archive backup the Concord maintained on site. The last line of documentary integrity. Paper in a vault that could not be remotely altered. She hit the door at full speed. Unlocked. Someone had already been through and not bothered to relock because they did not intend to return this way. The archive room was long and narrow, shelved floor to ceiling with documentation in fireproof cases. Accelerant pooled along the east wall in a dark, wet line, running 20 feet toward the primary vault at the back. Edrin Voss was at the vault door. She had not seen him before tonight. 50s, gray-haired, the compact, unremarkable build of a man who had spent a career being professionally invisible. He was reaching for the internal document housing when she came through the door, and he moved fast for a man his age. Not fast enough. He threw the ignition device past her, toward the accelerant line, and she had exactly one option, which was to remove the choice between the device and Voss entirely. She shifted mid-stride. Not fully. The bloodline strength channeled through a body still human-shaped, something between forms that she had not known was possible and that her body understood instinctively because it had been built for exactly this. She hit the device 3 feet before it reached the accelerant. Her shoulder took the shelving unit a half-second later. The pain was real and immediate, and she did not have time for it. Back on her feet before Voss reached the vault door. Between him and it before he completed the step. He looked at her. Professional neutrality. The specific flatness of a man who has moved past self-justification and is operating on the residue of a plan that has just failed. "You don't understand what you're protecting," he said. "The documentation," she said. "Not just your bloodline record." He almost smiled. "The Valecrest sovereignty provisions. The foundational documentation that makes you legally ungovernable by any existing conquered treaty structure." He looked past her at Vaelor in the doorway. "He found this 4 years ago. That's why he came looking for you. A surviving Valecrest heir is not subject to the sovereignty limitations governing every other apex ruler on this continent." He paused. "Including him." Seris looked at Vaelor. The gold eyes did not change, but she had been reading him for hours with calibration built from 22 years of necessity, and what she read was not denial. "Is that true?" she said. The archive room waited. "The research indicated the sovereignty provisions," Vaelor said. "Yes. You came to this summit looking for me. Looking for a surviving heir. I did not know who. I did not know what you were when I picked you up off the floor. But you knew what a surviving Valecrest heir would mean. Politically. Yes." The word landed between them like something dropped from height. Seris thought about the penthouse. About whatever belongs to you. About we. About a man who had been, in every hour of this night, something she had no reliable previous data point for. And about whether that thing was real or whether it was the most sophisticated management she had ever encountered, the kind that does not look like management because it has learned to look like something else entirely. She turned back to Voss. "The ignition device," she said. "On the floor." He stepped away from it. "Kaelin needs you in the strategy room," she said to Vaelor. The cipher decryption and the 4 council members Voss briefed about the Valecrest research. Names before the formal session at 8. Vaelor did not move immediately. He looked at her with those gold eyes, and she looked back, and this was not the first time tonight they had held this kind of eye contact, but it was the first time it carried this specific weight. 2 people who have been moving in the same direction all night and have just discovered the direction is more complicated than either of them knew. "And you," he said. "Right behind you," she said. "One more second." Then he moved. She listened until his footsteps disappeared. She looked at Voss. "The 4 names," she said. He gave them. She filed them in the place that had been keeping inventory for 11 years. Then she called Kaelin's people and watched them take Voss out, and she stood alone in the archive room between the empty accelerant line and the locked vault, and she breathed. The shoulder hurt badly now that the operational necessity had reduced its claim on her attention. She would need Lucien before the 8 o'clock session. 2 hours. Enough. She was very tired. This was the part that people who had never done sustained survival at this intensity did not understand. The cost was not located in the moments of crisis. Crisis produced adrenaline and compressed clarity. The cost came after, in the quiet room, in the specific physical weight of having been exactly what was required for exactly as long as required without the luxury of being anything else. She was 22 years old, and she had been exactly what was required for 22 years. She was still standing. She took the vault key and walked out into the north corridor. The pre-dawn light in the east-facing window had changed. Lighter now, genuinely lighter, the sky committing to morning after a night of refusing. She stood at the window and looked at the mountains. The cloud cover had shifted, and she could see the peaks for the first time since she arrived. Rock and ice. The particular stark existence of things that have no interest in being beautiful and are simply what they are. She heard footsteps from the west corridor. Vaelor came around the corner. He had not gone to the strategy room, or he had gone and returned. She did not ask. He stopped 6 feet away. The pre-dawn light caught the scar along his jaw and the quality of his face at this hour. Stripped of the summit ceremony, stripped of the military coat, just a man in a corridor above the mountains who had made a mistake and was standing in front of the person his mistake had affected without looking away. "I should have told you," he said. "Everything in the research, everything the sovereignty provisions meant. You had a right to that information from the moment you were conscious enough to receive it." "Yes," she said. "I don't have a version of that where I made the right call." "No. What I can tell you," he said, "is what I actually found when I started looking. Not the provisions, the person, the record of who your parents were, what Valecrest was before it was erased." He paused. "I have it. 4 years in the Stormfang archive. I was looking for you, and then I found you on the floor, and everything I had prepared to say became completely irrelevant." "What was I?" she said. He looked at her in the pre-dawn light. "A person," he said, "badly hurt, in broken glass. I stopped thinking about the sovereignty provisions approximately 30 seconds after I picked you up." The corridor was very quiet. She thought about walls, about what they were built for and what they cost, and what happens to the person inside them when the building has become the primary activity of a life. She thought about about the mountain outside the window, things that are simply what they are, without negotiation. "Show me the archive," she said. "When?" "After the 8 o'clock session, after everything that needs to happen before this night is officially over." She looked at him. "Show me who my parents were." "Yes," he said. Then from the stairwell, Kaelin's voice arrived at a volume that meant no time for calibration. "Sir, we have a problem." They both moved. Kaelin came through the door with the expression that meant something had developed faster than his ability to manage it. The council member Voss named, the one coordinating with Corvin's network for 18 months. He looked at Seris. "He left the summit building 40 minutes ago, before we had the names." He paused. He took Nicera Ashmore with him. The corridor received this. "Voluntarily," Kaelin said. "No indication of force. The window was closed. Her confession document was still on the desk." Seris thought about 11 seconds at a window. About, "I don't want to disappear." About a woman sitting on the floor of the East Wing room who had looked, for the first time in her memory, like someone who had set down something enormous and didn't know how to stand without it. She had extended something in that room. Not forgiveness, she knew the difference. Something else. The refusal to let another person's destruction be the price of her own survival. And Nicera had walked out into the pre-dawn dark with a man who had been feeding intelligence to her father's network for 18 months. "Relay station," Vaelor said to Kaelin. "East. 3 miles. If he files an emergency diplomatic claim before we intercept, it goes outside summit jurisdiction entirely. Timeline: on foot 40 minutes, by horse 20. We have 2 at the east stable available immediately." Seris was already moving toward the stairwell. "You don't have to do this," Vaelor said. "She told me she didn't want to disappear," Seris said without stopping. Whether that was true or the last performance of a woman who knows how to perform, I don't find that out by standing in a corridor. She hit the stairwell door. "Seris." She looked back. Pre-dawn light full in the corridor now. The mountain visible through the window. Rock and ice. The cold clarity of things that do not negotiate their own nature. Vaelor stood in it with the gold eyes and the scar and the face of a man who has learned the difference between moments that can be managed and moments that cannot. "Don't go alone," he said. 3 words. Not an order. Not a calculation. She held his gaze for 1 second. Then she pushed through the door and went down the stairs, and he was 2 steps behind her, and the east stable was cold and dark, and the horses were already saddled because Kaelin had called ahead, because Kaelin always called ahead, and the frozen ground outside the palace walls was hard under hooves as they cleared the gate. 3 miles east it's the breaking dawn, through mountain terrain that did not care about sovereignty provisions or forged documents or 22 years of buried inheritance. Whatever Nicera Ashmore had chosen was already in motion. And half a mile out, when the relay station signal tower became visible against the pale sky, Seris saw them. Two figures on the path ahead, one moving with purpose, and one moving with the particular quality of a person whose steps have lost their own direction. She pushed the horse harder. The mountain wind came off the peaks and hit her face, and in it, underneath the cold, she caught something that stopped her breath for exactly 1 second. Nicera's scent, and beneath it, the acrid chemical wrongness she had learned to recognize tonight. Not accelerant this time, not wolfbane derivative, something different, something that her bloodline was classifying with a speed and certainty that bypassed every other signal in her body and delivered one conclusion with absolute clarity. Nicera had not walked out of that east wing room. She had been walked out. And whatever was in her system had been there since before the confession, since before the window, since before 11 seconds of a choice that might not have been a choice at all. Seris looked at Vaelor riding hard beside her. He had caught it too. The relay station was 400 meters ahead. The council member was already at the door. And Nicera Ashmore, 25 years old, who had spent her entire life being exactly what her father needed her to be, was about to be used one final time as the instrument of a man who had decided that if he could not burn the documentation, he would burn the witness instead. Not tonight, Seris thought. She shifted, and the white wolf hit the frozen ground at full stride. The white wolf covered 400 meters of frozen ground in the time it took the council member to get the relay station door open. His name was Davin Kreth, and he had been on the Imperial Concord High Council for 11 years. And in those 11 years, he had made a very careful study of the difference between power that announces itself and power that operates quietly from positions that look like service. He had chosen the second kind. He had built his entire career on it, the advisor who smoothed over complications, the moderating voice in heated sessions, the man who knew where everybody was buried because he had helped carry several of them to the site. He understood, turning at the sound of hooves and then the sound of something heavier and faster than hooves, that he had made a miscalculation. The white wolf was not what he had prepared for. He had prepared for a girl, a newly awakened heir with no training and no framework and 22 years of conditioning telling her that her existence required justification. He had prepared for something manageable. He had received intelligence from Voss, from Wren, from the network that Corvin had built, and that he had been quietly co-directing for 18 months, that suggested a Valcrest heir, even awakened, would be operating at partial capacity, disoriented, dependent on the storm fang apparatus surrounding her. The intelligence had not accounted for what 22 years of survival actually produces in a person. Survival at that duration and intensity does not create fragility. It creates the specific, unbreakable competence of someone who has had to be enough for every situation they encountered with no support structure and no margin for error. It creates a person who does not require external validation to act because external validation was never available and the absence of it stopped being a limitation a long time ago. Davin Kreth had 11 seconds between the sound and the impact. He used them to do what men in his position always do in the final seconds of a plan's collapse. He grabbed the nearest available leverage. Nicera was beside him. She had been moving with the specific quality Seris had read from 400 meters out. Not the movement of someone choosing their direction, but the movement of someone whose direction was being managed for them, step by step, through a compound she now understood had been introduced to Nicera's system at some point during the evening, probably in the wine that the East Wing Guard had reported delivering an hour before midnight. Kreth had been patient about it. Patient men who operate from positions of apparent service are always the most dangerous kind, because their patience looks like loyalty until the moment it reveals itself as preparation. He had Nicera by the arm when the white wolf cleared the last 50 meters. Vaelor was 30 seconds behind on horseback. Seris shifted back at 10 meters, not from hesitation, from calculation. The space between Kreth and the relay station door was narrow, and Nicera was between them and a white wolf at full velocity in a confined approach was a risk she was not going to take with a person she was trying to get back intact. She came back to human form running and hit the frozen ground on 2 feet without breaking stride, and the transition produced pain across every muscle simultaneously, the kind of comprehensive physical accounting that her body had been accumulating all night and was now submitting in full. She ran through it. "Let her go," she said. Her voice came out raw. Not from fear, from the shift, from 4 hours of testimony, from a night that had used everything available and was now operating on the other side of available. Kreth looked at her across the 10 meters of frozen ground with Nicera between them and the relay station door behind him. He was calculating. She watched him calculate. This was something she was very good at. Watching intelligent people run their numbers and identifying the moment when the numbers stopped producing a viable output. She had watched it in Corven, in Voss, in Nicera on the East Wing floor. In each case, the calculation reached the same place eventually. The moment when the variables no longer summed to a survivable outcome, and the person running them had to decide whether to accept that or to reject it at a cost. "You have nothing left," she said. "Voss is in custody. Wren is in custody. The archive is locked, and the contest filing went through at 4:41 this morning. Whatever you file in that relay station in the next 5 minutes has no documentation to stand on." Kreth's jaw tightened. "The claim doesn't need documentation to delay proceedings," he said. "Diplomatic protective custody pending review buys time. Time is the only resource that matters right now." "Time for what?" she said. "For the 4 of us on the council to build an alternative record." "3 of you now," Vaelor said from behind her. Kreth looked past her at Vaelor coming off the horse. He did the math on that too, and she watched the math produce the result she had been waiting for. The specific result that arrives when a person realizes that the situation has become one they cannot talk their way out of, and that every remaining option requires a cost they did not budget for. What happened next was not dramatic in the way that final confrontations in stories are usually dramatic. There was no speech. There was no last threat or declaration, or the operatic flourish of a man going down insisting on his own significance. Davin Kreth looked at the white wolf standing in a human body in the pre-dawn cold with blood on her shoulder from a shelving unit and light still faint in her palms, and the absolute specific look of a woman who has already survived everything available and has therefore lost the ability to be frightened by implications. And he made a decision. He released Nicera's arm. She stepped away from him. Her legs were not working correctly. The compound, the cold, the cumulative weight of a night she had not chosen and had not had the capacity to resist. She would have gone down if Seris had not crossed the 10 meters and caught her. She was heavier than she looked. They had never touched before. 22 years of proximity and the specific grammar of their relationship had meant that physical contact was either a threat or an absence. There was no category in their shared history for this. One person holding the other upright in a frozen field at dawn because the other person's legs had stopped cooperating. Nicera looked at her. Her eyes were not fully tracking. The compound was still in her system and would need Lucian's attention within the hour. But she was present enough to register what was in front of her and to produce in the space between one breath and the next an expression that had no performance in it whatsoever. "I didn't choose," Nicera said. Her voice was slurred at the edges. "I want you to know, I didn't choose to go." "I know," Seris said. "I wrote the confession. I meant it." "I know that too." Nicera looked at her with the compound, slowed attention of someone trying to land a thought that keeps drifting. "Why did you come?" she said. Seris looked at her. She thought about the answer. Not performing the thought, actually thinking it, in the way she thought about things that mattered, without the managed distance she usually kept between herself and conclusions that cost something to reach. "Because you said you didn't want to disappear," she said. "And I have spent my entire life being made to disappear, and I decided a long time ago that I was not going to be the thing that does that to someone else, even someone who did it to me." Nicera was quiet for a long time, then, very quietly, "That's not forgiveness." "No," Seris said. "It's not." "What is it?" "I don't know yet. Ask me in a year." Kaelin arrived with 4 riders 12 minutes later and took Kreth into formal custody with the efficient lack of ceremony that characterized everything Kaelin did professionally. Nicera was loaded onto a horse with careful attention to the compound still working through her system and taken back to the palace medical wing, where Lucien would spend the next 3 hours undoing whatever Kreth had introduced to her wine. Seris stood in the frozen field as the riders moved away, and she let the silence arrive. It came in from the mountains, the way all real silence does in high country, not the absence of sound, but the presence of something older than sound, the particular quality of air that has been moving over rock and ice for longer than any of the dramas currently being conducted at its base. Vaelor stood beside her. They had not spoken since she caught Nicera. They had not needed to. This was the thing she was still calibrating to. This specific quality of his presence, where the absence of speech was not awkward and not loaded, but simply honest. Two people standing in a place without the requirement to perform anything for each other. The 8 o'clock session, she said. 2 hours. I need Lucian first. He'll be with Nisera. Then I'll wait. She looked at the mountains. Kreth will contest everything from custody. He has no documentation to stand on. You said it yourself. Men like Kreth don't need documentation. They need time and contacts and the specific patience of someone who has been operating in the margins for 11 years. She paused. He'll find another angle. Then we stay ahead of the angle, Vaelor said. She looked at him. We, she said, not a challenge. The word from his vocabulary, examined in her own mouth, turned to see how it felt with the full weight of the night behind it. He looked at her with the gold eyes in the morning light. Real morning now, the sun clearing the eastern peaks and throwing long shadows across the frozen ground, the kind of light that does not flatter anything but shows everything accurately. I should have told you about the sovereignty provisions, he said. That is not a thing I can fix retroactively. What I can tell you is that every decision I made tonight, from the ballroom to the archive room to this field, was made because of you, not because of what you represent politically. And I understand that you have no particular reason to believe that distinction. No, she said. I don't. But you came back into the corridor last night when you could have stayed in the medical wing. I had reasons of my own for that. And you memorized 11 years of correspondence not because anyone asked you to. Insurance, she said. I told you. Yes, he said. But insurance is what you call something when you're not ready to admit that you were already fighting back, that you have been fighting back, in the only way available to you for years. He paused. That's not a woman who needs someone to carry her. She looked at the mountains for a long time. Here is what she had learned about trust in 22 years of its systematic absence. It is not a decision made once. It is not a gate you open or close. It is a practice. It is the daily, mundane, effortful practice of extending the assumption of good faith to another person and then paying attention to what they do with it and adjusting accordingly and continuing. It requires more maintenance than walls. It produces more vulnerability than walls. And it is the only thing that builds something worth living inside, as opposed to something worth surviving inside. She had been surviving inside walls for 22 years. She was very tired of the inside of walls. Show me the archive, she said. After the session, my parents, everything you found. Yes. And the sovereignty provisions, all of it, the full legal framework, what it means, what it enables, and what it complicates. She turned to look at him. No more incomplete information. No more incomplete information, he said. She looked at him for a long moment in the morning light. That's the agreement, she said. Not a dynasty agreement, not a political alignment, an agreement between two people that the information flows in both directions or it doesn't flow at all. That's the agreement, he said. They rode back to the palace in the full morning light with the mountain wind coming off the peaks and the summit banners visible from half a mile out, snapping in the cold air above walls that had seen a great deal of history and were about to see more. The 8 o'clock session was the most documented proceeding in Imperial Concord history up to that point. Tyreth Mose convened it with the flat precision of a woman who had been awake since midnight and had found in that sleeplessness a particular clarity of purpose. The 12 council members present included the 3 who had received Voss's Valecrest intelligence briefings and had said nothing. They sat with the specific rigidity of people who understand that the most they can hope for at this point is the opportunity to demonstrate cooperation. The 4th, Kreth, was represented by a Concord procedural advocate who said very little and wrote a great deal. Seris stood on the chamber floor, not in midnight garments from the royal chambers, not in the servant uniform she had arrived in. Kaelin had found her something from the palace administrative stores. Dark, practical clothing, not ceremonial, not servant, just functional and clean, which was exactly what she wanted. She was not performing a transformation for this room. She was not arriving as a symbol. She was arriving as a person with documentation and testimony and 22 years of inventory, and she was going to deliver all of it in exactly the language it deserved. Vaelor stood to the side, not behind her, not in front. To the side, which was the spatial language of the position he had taken in the corridor when she caught Nicera, and she understood it now with the full clarity of the morning. This was not a posture of deference, and it was not a posture of equal authority. It was the posture of a man who has decided that his presence in a room belongs to the person standing in the center of it, and that the most powerful thing he can offer in this moment is not intervention, but witness. A ruler willing to stand beside rather than in front of becomes very difficult to manipulate. The session ran for 4 hours. Seris spoke for most of them. She spoke about the mat in the stone corridor, and the compound in her food, and the forged death of a family she had never been allowed to know. She spoke about the correspondence she had memorized at 16, and the names she had been keeping, and the inventory of 11 years that she now delivered to the full Concord record with the methodical precision of a woman who understands that the most powerful thing a previously invisible person can do is become undeniable. She spoke without trembling, not because she was not afraid. Fear had been her constant companion for 22 years, and she had long ago stopped expecting it to leave entirely. But because she had understood, somewhere between the penthouse and the archive room and the frozen field at dawn, that fear and action are not mutually exclusive. Fear is simply information. It tells you that something matters. And the things that mattered in this room, the documentation, the testimony, the permanent public record that would exist in the Concord archive long after everyone in this chamber was gone, they mattered enough to speak through whatever her body was doing with the fear. Massa called the formal ruling at noon. Corvin Ashmore, stripped of title, estate, and all dynastic claims. Imperial confinement pending full criminal proceedings on charges of bloodline fraud, criminal suppression, and deliberate administration of a controlled compound over a sustained period. Nicera Ashmore. Labor accountability in the Northern Administrative Territories, a sentence designed not as punishment in isolation, but as the specific corrective of requiring a woman who had spent her life operating through inherited systems of exploitation to spend several years in the direct experience of productive work without inherited advantage. Whether it would produce the change it was intended to produce was a question that only time could answer. Seris had offered no opinion on the sentencing. It was not her place to offer one. She had said what she knew, and the council had made its determination. And what Nicera did with whatever came after was Nicera's work, not hers. Davin Kreth. Immediate removal from the High Council, criminal custody, full investigation of his Corvin network coordination. The 3 remaining council members who had received Voss's intelligence briefings without acting, formal censure, supervised mandate review, a documented condition on their continued service that made their knowledge of the Valecrest research and their silence about it part of the permanent record. Voss. Full cooperation agreement. His testimony was the most comprehensive single piece of intelligence on the Ashmore network structure the Concord had ever received. And Mosse was a practical woman who understood the difference between punishment as an end and accountability as a means. House Valecrest, formally restored. The sovereignty provisions reinstated in the Concord constitutional record. The estate claims and financial holdings to be calculated and returned through a process that would take months and require more work than this single session could accomplish. When Mosse read the final ruling, the chamber was very quiet. Seris stood in the center of it, and she let the quiet exist. She did not feel what she had expected to feel, which was the specific burning release of a pressure that had been building for 22 years. What she felt instead was something quieter and more complicated. Not relief, not triumph, not even the satisfaction of justice, which is never as clean in reality as it is in the anticipation. What she felt was the particular unfamiliar sensation of ground under her feet that was actually solid. Not the ground of managed survival, not the ground of walls and inventory and the compressed efficiency of someone who is always preparing for the next threat. Just ground. The real kind. The kind you can build on. She walked out of the chamber in the full afternoon light, and she stood in the corridor outside it, and she pressed her back against the stone, and she closed her eyes. 3 breaths. Just 3. Then she opened her eyes. Vaelor was leaning against the wall across the corridor from her with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who has been awake for approximately 30 hours and is not particularly troubled by this. "The archive," she said. "Tonight," he said, "after you sleep." "I'm not, Seris." She looked at him. You've been running on the edge of your blood composition for 12 hours, he said. Lucien's orders were rest before anything else. The archive will be there tonight. Your parents' records are not going anywhere. He paused. Neither am I. She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light in the corridor was different from the penthouse light and the pre-dawn light and the archive room light. Warmer, more ordinary, the light of a palace in the middle of a workday that was going to involve an enormous amount of administrative consequence, regardless of whether she was conscious to oversee it. 4 hours, she said. 8. 5. 7. 6, she said. Final offer. The corner of his mouth shifted. 6, he said. She pushed off the wall. She was almost to the east stairwell when she stopped. She turned back. Vaelor. He was still leaning against the wall, watching her with the gold eyes in the afternoon light. What you said in the field, she said, about fighting back, about the inventory. Yes. You were right. She said it simply, without decoration. I have been fighting back. For years. In the only way that was available to me. She held his gaze. But I'm done with that being the only way available. He looked at her for a moment. Yes, he said. You are. She went up the stairs. 6 months later, the Concord rebuilt itself in ways that made the summit seem, in retrospect, not like a crisis, but like a surgery. The kind that is brutal in the operating room and necessary for everything that comes after. Corvin's criminal proceedings produced a documentation chain that exposed 3 additional noble families operating similar suppression structures against bloodline heirs. They had absorbed through legal fraud. Each case opened its own proceedings. The archive became the most consulted record in Concord history that year. Nisera wrote 1 letter from the Northern Territories. It arrived at the Stormfang Citadel in late autumn, addressed in the precise hand of a woman who had been practicing penmanship since she was 4 years old. It was not an apology. She and Seris had established in the East Wing room that apologies were not the right currency for what existed between them. It was a description. 2 pages of what she had been doing for 3 months. The work, the people, the specific quality of exhaustion that comes from earning rather than inheriting. At the bottom, in smaller letters than the rest, I am finding out what I'm made of without the architecture. It is uncomfortable. I think it is also necessary. Seris read it twice. She wrote back, the Stormfang Citadel in winter was a different kind of cold than the Ashmore Highlands. The same altitude, roughly, but the cold had a different character. Drier, cleaner, the cold of a place that had been honestly itself for a long time, rather than the cold of a place that used its severity as a management tool. She had noticed this distinction in her first week there and had filed it the way she filed everything, in the place that had been accumulating inventory for 22 years and had now shifted its function from survival documentation to the other kind, the kind that builds rather than merely records. She was learning statecraft from Kalen, who taught it the way he did everything, with maximum information, density, and minimum decoration, which suited her exactly. She was learning the Stormfang military history from the archive, 3 hours most evenings after the administrative work was done. She was learning with more difficulty than either of the other things how to occupy space without apology. That last one was the hardest. 22 years of conditioning does not dissolve in a single night, however significant. It persists in the small moments. The automatic downward cast of eyes in certain social configurations, the reflex to make herself less visible when a room fills with people who carry authority, the deeply grooved habit of accounting for her own presence as though it requires ongoing justification. She worked on it the way she worked on everything difficult, with patience and without self-criticism, because self-criticism was a tool that the Ashmore household had used on her for years, and she had decided, with clear deliberateness, to stop using it on herself. One evening, late in the first winter, she was in the Stormfang archive with the records of House Valacrest open on the table in front of her. She had read them many times by then. She had read about her parents, Emera and Theo Valacrest, both documented apex shifters, both dead before she was old enough to form memories, in circumstances that the Concord investigation was still untangling. She had read about the bloodline history, the generations of white wolves, the sovereignty provisions, the specific legal architecture that made House Valacrest an anomaly in the Concord's otherwise orderly hierarchy of power. She had read about herself in the original documents, the ones predating the forgery, heir designate, bloodline confirmed, future unknown. She had read it all. Tonight she was not reading. She was sitting with her hands flat on the table and looking at the documents and thinking about the specific thing that nobody had prepared her for, which was this: knowing who you were supposed to be does not automatically tell you who you are. The documents could give her back her name and her legal standing and her family's history. They could not give her back the 22 years she had spent becoming something else entirely through the force of circumstance. And she was not sure she would have wanted them to, because the woman she had become in those years was the one who had memorized 11 years of correspondence and read every threat from the texture of a silence and run up the stairs into the North Corridor at 5 in the morning because the thing that needed doing was there and she was the one available to do it. She would not trade that woman, not even for the one she was supposed to be. The archive door opened. Vaelor came in with 2 cups of something warm and set one beside her documents without asking whether she wanted it, which was either presumptuous or accurate, depending on how you looked at it. She had decided months ago that in his case it was accurate. He sat across from her and looked at the documents. "The ones from before?" he said. "Yes." "You've read them enough to recite them." "Probably." He looked at her. "Do you regret the crown?" he said. She looked at the documents for a long moment. She thought about the mat in the stone corridor, about the burning in her arm and the compound in her food, and the forged death of a family she was still learning. About the night that had dismantled the architecture of 22 years in the space of 12 hours and left her standing in a field at dawn, holding a woman who had tried to hurt her in one hand and a vault key in the other. She thought about ground that was actually solid, about the practice of trust, about the specific, daily, unglamorous work of building something worth living inside rather than merely surviving in. "The crown was never the reward," she said. He looked at her. "What was?" he said. She looked at the documents, at her own name, written in someone else's hand on paper that had outlasted everyone who touched it. At the light still faint in her palms, steady now, belonging to her the way breathing belonged to her. Not a power she wielded, but a fact of what she was. She looked at the man across the table who had told her no more incomplete information, and had in the 6 months since kept that agreement with the same flat consistency he kept everything, not perfectly, not without friction, but honestly, which was the only version of kept that mattered. "Freedom," she said. The citadel was quiet around them. Outside, the winter held the mountains in its long grip, and the northern sky ran on forever above the frozen cliffs, indifferent and vast and entirely without agenda. Inside, in the archive room, the heir of a house that had been buried alive read the record of who she had always been and understood, for the first time with her full body and not just her mind, that survival was not the end of the story. It was just where the story began.